The assassination of Philip II of Macedon at his daughter Cleopatra's wedding in 336 BC thrust the ancient world into uncertainty. As the king lay dying from Pausanias's blade, the carefully constructed Macedonian war machine that had spent decades subjugating the fractious Greek city-states suddenly faced an existential crisis. Philip's 20-year-old son Alexander stood at the precipice of either inheriting one of antiquity's most formidable military forces or watching it disintegrate under the weight of Greek rebellion and internal Macedonian power struggles. Alexander's ascension proved swift and ruthless. Within days of his father's death, he had eliminated potential rivals to the throne, including his stepmother Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant son, ensuring no competing claims could emerge. The young king's immediate priority lay not in mourning, but in demonstrating that Macedonian supremacy over Greece would continue unabated. When Thebes, Athens, and other city-states interpreted Philip's death as an opportunity to throw off Macedonian control, Alexander moved with characteristic decisiveness. The speed of Alexander's response caught the Greek rebels off guard. His army appeared before Thebes in 335 BC like a thunderbolt, the phalanxes advancing in perfect formation while the companion cavalry wheeled around the city's flanks. The siege lasted mere weeks, but its conclusion sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. Alexander's forces breached Thebes' walls and systematically demolished the city, selling its population into slavery while sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. This calculated brutality served its intended purpose. Other Greek cities quickly submitted rather than face similar destruction. With Greece firmly under Macedonian control, Alexander turned his attention to the grand project his father had envisioned, the conquest of the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Empire under Darius III controlled territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, encompassing modern-day Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia and Pakistan. This vast domain represented the accumulated wealth and power of over 2 centuries of Persian rule, defended by armies that had successfully maintained control over dozens of distinct peoples and cultures. In spring 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 35,000 troops, a force that represented the finest military technology and training of its era. The Macedonian phalanx formed the army's backbone, dense formations of soldiers wielding 18-foot sarissas that created an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. These infantry units worked in coordination with the elite companion cavalry, heavily armoured horsemen who served as both Alexander's personal guard and his primary striking force in battle. The first major confrontation came at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor. Persian forces had positioned themselves along the river's eastern bank, hoping to prevent Alexander's army from establishing a foothold in Asia. The battle demonstrated both Alexander's tactical brilliance and his personal courage. Rather than attempting a frontal assault across the water, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a diagonal charge that struck the Persian left flank while his infantry crossed at multiple points along the river. Persian resistance crumbled as their cavalry found itself outmaneuvered and their Greek mercenary infantry isolated. The victory opened Western Asia Minor to Macedonian occupation and provided Alexander with his first significant Persian treasury. As Alexander's forces advanced through Asia Minor, they encountered a complex political landscape. Many Greek cities along the coast welcomed the Macedonians as liberators from Persian rule, though Alexander quickly made clear that liberation meant incorporation into his growing empire rather than independence. Persian satraps and local rulers faced a stark choice: submission or destruction. Most chose the former, recognizing that resistance would likely prove futile given Alexander's demonstrated military superiority. The second decisive encounter occurred at Issus in 333 BC, where Darius III personally commanded a massive Persian army. The Persian king had assembled forces from across his empire, including elite units like the Immortals, Greek mercenaries, and cavalry from various satrapies. Darius positioned his army on a narrow coastal plain, believing the confined space would negate Alexander's tactical advantages. This decision proved catastrophic. The restricted battlefield prevented the Persians from utilizing their numerical superiority, while allowing Alexander to concentrate his forces for maximum impact. Alexander again led from the front, directing his companion cavalry in a charge that shattered the Persian left wing and drove directly toward Darius's position. Contemporary accounts describe the Persian king's elaborate chariot, adorned with gold and precious stones, becoming the focal point of desperate fighting as Macedonian cavalry pressed their attack. When Darius fled the battlefield, Persian resistance collapsed entirely. The victory at Issus netted Alexander not only another Persian army, but also Darius's family, including his wife and daughters, who became valuable hostages. The conquest of Egypt followed with surprising ease. Persian rule had never gained deep roots among the Egyptian population, who viewed their Achaemenid overlords as foreign occupiers. Egyptian priests welcomed Alexander as a pharaoh and legitimate ruler, conducting the traditional ceremonies that confirmed his divine status according to ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. During his stay in Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria near the Nile Delta, the first and most famous of the many cities that would bear his name throughout his conquered territories. Alexandria's location demonstrated Alexander's strategic thinking. Positioned between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile River, the city could serve simultaneously as a naval base, commercial centre, and administrative capital for Egyptian affairs. Alexander personally supervised the city's initial planning, walking the proposed boundaries while architects and engineers recorded his instructions. The city's grid pattern, wide boulevards, and designated areas for different functions reflected Greek urban planning principles adapted to Egyptian conditions. The final confrontation with Darius came at Gaugamela in 331 BC, where the Persian king had assembled what many historians consider the largest army of the ancient world. Darius had learned from his previous defeats, choosing a vast plain that allowed his forces to deploy in their full strength, while providing space for his scythed chariots and war elephants to operate effectively. The Persian battle line stretched for miles, incorporating troops from across the empire. Bactrian cavalry, Indian war elephants, Scythian horse archers, and Persian infantry units equipped with a variety of weapons and armour. Alexander faced this enormous host with roughly 47,000 troops, still primarily Macedonian and Greek forces, supplemented by some Asian allies. The disparity in numbers was so significant that many of Alexander's officers counselled a night attack to avoid facing the full Persian army in daylight. Alexander rejected this advice, reportedly stating that he would not steal victory like a thief. His confidence proved justified through tactical brilliance rather than mere bravado. The Battle of Gaugamela showcased Alexander's mastery of combined arms warfare. He deployed his forces in an oblique formation, with his right wing advanced and his left wing refused, creating gaps in the Persian line as Darius's forces attempted to maintain contact across the entire front. When Persian chariots charged the Macedonian centre, disciplined infantry units opened ranks to allow the vehicles to pass harmlessly through before closing again to resume their advance. Alexander personally led his companion cavalry through a gap that developed in the Persian line, driving directly towards Darius's position for the third time in their encounters. Once again, Darius fled the battlefield, but this time his flight marked the effective end of Achaemenid resistance. Persian forces scattered across the empire, some units maintaining local resistance but none capable of challenging Alexander's continued advance. The victory at Gaugamela opened the Persian heartland to Macedonian occupation and provided Alexander with the accumulated treasures of Persepolis, wealth that would fund his subsequent campaigns and administrative reforms. Alexander's treatment of conquered Persian territories revealed a sophisticated understanding of imperial administration that went far beyond mere military occupation. Rather than attempting to impose purely Macedonian or Greek systems of governance, he adopted and adapted existing Persian administrative structures. Persian satraps who submitted were often retained in their positions, though usually with Macedonian military commanders to ensure loyalty. This pragmatic approach recognised that effective control over such vast territories required cooperation from existing power structures rather than their complete replacement. The policy of cultural fusion that Alexander implemented represented perhaps his most significant departure from traditional Greek attitudes toward non-Greeks. Previous Greek military campaigns, such as those during the Persian Wars, had emphasized the fundamental differences between Greek and barbarian cultures. Alexander instead promoted integration between Greek and Persian customs, encouraging his soldiers to marry local women and adopting Persian court ceremonies himself. This cultural synthesis manifested in various ways throughout Alexander's conquered territories. He began wearing Persian royal dress on formal occasions, incorporated Persian nobles into his court hierarchy, and required his Macedonian officers to perform proskinesis, the traditional Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king. These innovations created significant tension with traditional Macedonian customs, leading to several conspiracies among his officers who viewed such practices as degrading to their status as Greeks. Alexander's city-founding program extended far beyond Alexandria in Egypt. Throughout his campaigns, he established dozens of new settlements, most bearing his name or designed to honour Macedonian traditions. These cities served multiple purposes. They provided homes for Greek and Macedonian veterans, created centres of Greek culture in conquered territories, and established strategic points for controlling local populations. Each new foundation required careful planning regarding location, population, and economic base. The most significant of these settlements included Alexandria Eschate, founded during campaigns in Central Asia, and Butefala in India, named after Alexander's famous horse. These cities typically received populations drawn from multiple sources: Macedonian and Greek veterans, local inhabitants, and sometimes relocated populations from other conquered territories. The mixing of different cultural groups within these urban centres accelerated the process of Hellenization that would characterize the subsequent centuries. Alexander's administrative reforms extended to military organization as well. As his army advanced deeper into Asia, he increasingly incorporated local troops into his forces, training Persian and other Asian soldiers in Macedonian fighting techniques while maintaining the core structure of the phalanx and companion cavalry. This integration served practical purposes, replacing casualties and expanding available manpower, but also reflected his broader vision of a unified empire that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The transformation of Alexander's army from a purely Macedonian force into a multi-ethnic military organization created new challenges and opportunities. Persian cavalry units proved particularly valuable, bringing different fighting techniques and knowledge of local terrain. At the same time, the presence of foreign troops in traditionally Macedonian units generated resentment among veteran soldiers who viewed these changes as threats to their privileged status within the army hierarchy. Alexander's personal transformation during these years reflected the broader changes occurring throughout his empire. The young king who had crossed the Hellespont as a Macedonian warrior gradually adopted the trappings and attitudes of an Asian monarch. He claimed divine status not only according to Egyptian traditions, but also in relation to Greek religious beliefs, asserting descent from Achilles and divine favour from Zeus. These claims, while serving political purposes in legitimizing his rule over diverse populations, further alienated traditional Macedonian supporters. The geographical scope of Alexander's conquests by 323 BC encompassed an area larger than any previous empire in human history. From Macedonia in the west to the Indus River in the east, from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to the cataracts of the Nile in the south, his territories included virtually every major centre of ancient civilization. The logistical challenges of maintaining control over such distances, combined with the cultural complexities of governing dozens of distinct peoples, would have tested any administrative system. Alexander's sudden death in Babylon on June 10th, 323 BC created an immediate crisis that exposed the fundamental weaknesses in his imperial structure. Despite his military genius and administrative innovations, he'd failed to establish clear succession arrangements or institutional frameworks capable of maintaining unity after his death. The empire's vast extent, which had been a source of strength during his lifetime, immediately became a liability as communication delays and regional interests began to assert themselves. The circumstances surrounding Alexander's death remain disputed among ancient sources. Some accounts suggest poisoning, others point to fever and illness, possibly malaria or typhoid, exacerbated by heavy drinking and previous wounds. What remains certain is that his death caught his generals completely unprepared for the transition of power. Alexander's only legitimate heir was his mentally disabled half-brother Philip III Aridaeus, while his wife Roxana was pregnant with a son who would become Alexander IV. The power vacuum that emerged immediately after Alexander's death revealed the tensions that had been building throughout his reign between different factions within the Macedonian leadership. The Diadochi, his generals and close companions, quickly divided into competing groups based on personal loyalties, regional interests, and differing visions for the empire's future. Some, like Perdiccas, sought to maintain imperial unity under a regency government. Others, like Ptolemy and Antigonus, began carving out independent territories that they could control directly. The initial distribution of satrapies at Babylon attempted to preserve some semblance of unified administration, while acknowledging the reality that only the strongest generals could maintain control over their assigned territories. Ptolemy received Egypt, Antigonus took much of Asia Minor, Seleucus was assigned Babylonia, and other commanders received smaller but strategically important regions. These arrangements, intended as temporary measures until Alexander's heir came of age, instead became the foundation for the successor kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 3 centuries. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire began almost immediately, as each Diadochus faced the choice between maintaining loyalty to a central authority that lacked effective power or establishing independent control over their territories. The vast distances involved made coordination difficult, while the diverse populations within each satrapy created local challenges that required immediate attention. Within months of Alexander's death, what had been a unified empire began transforming into a collection of competing kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy as the true heir to Alexander's legacy. The death of Alexander created an immediate constitutional crisis that exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Macedonian kingship. Traditional Macedonian law required the army assembly to confirm any new monarch, yet Alexander's potential heirs presented impossible choices. Philip III. Aridaeus possessed the bloodline but lacked the mental capacity to rule effectively, while Roxana's unborn child, if male, would require decades of regency before assuming power. The Macedonian nobles gathered in Babylon faced the prospect of either fragmenting the empire immediately or attempting to maintain unity through an unprecedented regency arrangement. Perdiccas, Alexander's bodyguard and chiliarch, moved quickly to assert control over the succession process. As the holder of Alexander's signet ring, he claimed authority to act as regent for both potential heirs until a permanent solution could be established. This position theoretically granted him command over the entire empire, but the practical reality proved far more complex. The other Diadochi possessed their own armies, controlled vast territories, and harboured personal ambitions that made them unlikely to submit to any central authority for extended periods. The initial partition discussions in Babylon revealed the deep divisions among Alexander's former companions. Meleager, commander of the phalanx infantry, supported the immediate coronation of Philip III Aridaeus, believing this would preserve traditional Macedonian customs and maintain the infantry's political influence. The cavalry commanders, led by Perdiccas, preferred waiting for Roxana's child while establishing a regency council. These competing factions reflected broader tensions between different military units and social classes within the Macedonian army structure. The compromise reached at Babylon satisfied no one completely but prevented immediate civil war. Philip III Aridaeus would become king immediately, while any male child born to Roxana would become co-ruler upon reaching maturity. Perdiccas would serve as regent with supreme military command, while Craterus received the title of Prostates, guardian of the royal family, giving him theoretical oversight of Perdiccas's actions. This arrangement created a dual power structure that virtually guaranteed future conflict between the two most powerful generals. The distribution of satrapies that accompanied this settlement reflected both practical necessities and personal relationships among the Diadochi. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions and possibly his half-brother, received Egypt, a prize that combined immense wealth, natural defensive barriers, and relative isolation from other major power centres. His selection of this satrapy demonstrated remarkable strategic foresight, as Egypt's geographical position would allow him to defend against attacks while maintaining access to Mediterranean trade routes. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed veteran who had served Philip II before joining Alexander's campaigns, obtained the crucial satrapies of Greater Phrygia, Lycia and Pamphylia in Western Asia Minor. These territories controlled the land bridge between Europe and Asia, while providing access to both the Black Sea and Mediterranean coasts. Antigonus's military reputation and extensive network of personal loyalties made him a natural choice for this strategically vital region, though his ambitions would soon prove incompatible with any power-sharing arrangement. Seleucus, another of Alexander's bodyguards, received Babylonia, the administrative heart of the former Persian Empire. This appointment placed him in control of the vast bureaucratic machinery that had governed Asian territories for centuries, along with access to the accumulated treasures of multiple Persian royal capitals. The position required exceptional administrative skills to manage the complex relationships between Greek colonists, Persian nobles, and various indigenous populations throughout Mesopotamia. Antipater remained in Macedonia, as he had throughout Alexander's campaigns, continuing his role as regent over the European territories. His position differed fundamentally from the Asian appointments, as he controlled the Macedonian homeland and the Greek city-states that provided the empire's military and cultural foundation. Antipater's advanced age and conservative political views made him a stabilizing influence, though his distance from Asian affairs would limit his ability to influence events in the former Persian territories. The smaller satrapies went to various other commanders based on their military contributions and personal relationships with Alexander. Lysimachus received Thrace, a region that required constant military attention due to tribal incursions and its strategic position, controlling access to the Black Sea. Eumenes, despite being Greek rather than Macedonian, obtained Cappadocia and Paphlagonia in recognition of his administrative abilities and loyalty to the royal family. These appointments created a complex web of competing interests that would inevitably lead to conflict as each satrap consolidated power within his assigned territory. The death of Malaga within weeks of the partition eliminated one potential source of opposition to Perdiccas's authority, but it also demonstrated the regent's willingness to use violence against fellow Macedonians to maintain control. This execution sent a clear message to other potential rivals, while simultaneously alienating moderate elements within the army who preferred negotiated solutions to political disputes. The incident established a precedent for the brutal elimination of competitors that would characterize the subsequent wars of succession. Perdiccas's attempt to maintain imperial unity faced immediate challenges from multiple directions. Ptolemy's occupation of Egypt proceeded smoothly, as the Persian satrap Cleomenes offered no significant resistance, and the Egyptian population welcomed another change in leadership. However, Ptolemy's subsequent actions revealed his intention to establish independent control rather than serve as Perdiccas's subordinate. He eliminated Cleomenes and began implementing administrative reforms that prioritized Egyptian interests over imperial unity. The most dramatic early challenge to Perdiccas's authority came from an unexpected source. When Alexander's funeral cortege began its journey from Babylon towards Macedonia, where tradition demanded royal burial, Ptolemy intercepted the procession in Syria and diverted it to Egypt. This audacious act served multiple purposes. It provided Ptolemy with a powerful symbol of legitimacy, denied other claimants access to Alexander's body for propaganda purposes, and demonstrated his independence from central authority. The hijacking of Alexander's body represented more than symbolic defiance. In Macedonian and Greek religious beliefs, proper burial of a king was essential for maintaining divine favour and political legitimacy. By controlling Alexander's remains, Ptolemy could claim special status as the guardian of the conqueror's legacy, while preventing rivals from using the burial ceremony to enhance their own positions. The construction of Alexander's tomb in Alexandria would become a major tourist attraction and source of prestige for the Ptolemaic dynasty. Perdiccas's response to this provocation revealed both his military capabilities and the limitations of his political position. Rather than accepting Ptolemy's fait accompli, he assembled a large army and marched toward Egypt in 321 BC, determined to reassert central authority through military force. This decision transformed what had been political maneuvering into open warfare, crossing a threshold that would define the next 4 decades of Hellenistic history. The invasion of Egypt demonstrated the practical difficulties of maintaining unified command over Alexander's former territories. Perdiccas's army included troops from multiple satrapies, many of whom had stronger personal loyalties to their regional commanders than to the regent. The logistical challenges of moving and supplying such a force across the Syrian desert tested the limits of ancient military organisation, while the prospect of fighting fellow Macedonians created morale problems among veteran soldiers. Ptolemy's defensive strategy exploited Egypt's natural advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with Perdiccas's superior numbers. He fortified the Nile Delta's eastern approaches, destroyed bridges and ferry crossings, and positioned his forces to take advantage of the river's seasonal flooding patterns. When Perdiccas attempted to force a crossing near Memphis, his troops found themselves struggling against both Egyptian defenders and the Nile's treacherous currents. The disaster at the Nile crossing marked the beginning of Perdiccas's downfall. His forces suffered heavy casualties while achieving no strategic objectives, leading to widespread criticism of his leadership abilities. More significantly, the failed assault demonstrated that maintaining imperial unity would require constant military campaigns against fellow Macedonians, a prospect that many veterans found distasteful after decades of fighting foreign enemies under Alexander's leadership. The conspiracy that eliminated Perdiccas developed rapidly among his own officers, who recognized that continued association with his failed policies would damage their own careers and endanger their troops. Pethan and Antigenes, both experienced commanders with their own territorial ambitions, organized the plot that resulted in Perdiccas's assassination in his own tent. The murder occurred with the tacit approval of much of the army, which had grown tired of the regent's authoritarian methods and unsuccessful military ventures. The death of Perdiccas created another power vacuum that required immediate resolution to prevent complete collapse of any pretense of imperial unity. The surviving Diadochi gathered at Triparadissus in northern Syria during summer 321 BC to negotiate a new distribution of power and territory. This conference would prove even more significant than the original Babylon settlement, as it acknowledged the reality of imperial fragmentation while attempting to create stable boundaries between competing kingdoms. Antipater emerged as the dominant figure at Triparadissus, despite his advanced age and physical frailty. His control over Macedonia and Greece, combined with his reputation for political moderation, made him an acceptable choice as the new regent. However, his appointment represented a fundamental shift in the empire's centre of gravity, from Asia back toward Europe, effectively acknowledging that the Persian territories would increasingly operate as independent entities under nominal Macedonian oversight. The redistribution of satrapies at Triparadissus reflected the changed balance of power following Perdiccas's death. Antigonus Monophthalmus received a massive expansion of his authority, gaining control over most of Asia Minor along with responsibility for continuing the war against Eumenes, who had remained loyal to Perdiccas and now controlled significant forces in Cappadocia. This appointment transformed Antigonus from a regional satrap into one of the most powerful figures in the Hellenistic world. Seleucus retained Babylonia, but found his position significantly weakened by the recent conflicts. Antigonus's expanded authority included supervision of Eastern affairs, effectively making Seleucus subordinate to his former peer. This arrangement would prove temporary, as Seleucus possessed both the administrative skills and territorial resources necessary to establish independent power once circumstances permitted. Ptolemy's position remained unchanged by the Triparadissus settlement, a tacit acknowledgement that his control over Egypt had become irreversible. His successful defence against Perdiccas, combined with his possession of Alexander's body and the wealth of the Nile Valley, made him too powerful to challenge directly. The other Diadochi chose to focus their attention on more vulnerable targets while allowing Ptolemy to consolidate his Egyptian kingdom. The emergence of Eumenes as a major independent power created complications that the Triparadissus settlement could not resolve. Unlike the other Diadochi, Eumenes lacked Macedonian ancestry, making his claims to authority dependent entirely on his administrative abilities and loyalty to Alexander's family. His continued resistance to the new arrangements, combined with his control over significant military forces and treasury resources, posed a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the entire post-Perdiccas system. Antigonus's campaign against Eumenes would consume much of the next several years, as the Greek administrator proved remarkably skilled at both military tactics and political maneuvering. Eumenes successfully recruited Persian nobles and Asian troops who remained loyal to Alexander's memory, creating a multi-ethnic army that could challenge traditional Macedonian forces on equal terms. His ability to maintain resistance despite being vastly outnumbered demonstrated the continuing appeal of imperial unity among certain segments of the conquered populations. The pursuit of Eumenes led Antigonus deep into the eastern satrapies, where he encountered the growing independence of local commanders who had been largely ignored during the western conflicts. Pithon, satrap of Media, had been expanding his influence throughout the Iranian plateau, while other eastern commanders had begun operating as autonomous rulers rather than subordinates of distant authorities. Antigonus's eastern campaigns thus served the dual purpose of eliminating Eumenes while reasserting some measure of central control over these remote territories. The final confrontation between Antigonus and Eumenes occurred at Gabiene in 316 BC, where superior numbers and the treachery of Eumenes' own troops finally ended the Greek administrator's resistance. The Silver Shields, Alexander's veteran infantry unit that had served as Eumenes' core force, betrayed their commander in exchange for the return of their families and baggage, which Antigonus had captured through a clever flanking maneuver. Eumenes' execution eliminated the last significant advocate for imperial unity under Alexander's heirs. With Eumenes dead and the eastern satrapies under his control, Antigonus had assembled a power base that potentially exceeded any other single Diadochus. His territories stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, while his treasury contained the accumulated wealth of multiple Persian royal capitals. More importantly, his military forces included both traditional Macedonian units and the diverse Asian troops that had proven so effective under Alexander's command. Antigonus's growing power inevitably attracted the attention of his former allies, who recognized that his success threatened their own independence. Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and eventually Seleucus began coordinating their opposition to what they perceived as Antigonus's bid for universal monarchy. This coalition represented a fundamental shift from the personal rivalries that had characterized earlier conflicts toward a more systematic balance of power approach to Hellenistic politics. The formation of the anti-Antigonid coalition marked the beginning of a new phase in the succession wars, as the surviving Diadochi abandoned any pretense of maintaining imperial unity in favour of preventing any single ruler from achieving dominance over the others. This development transformed the conflict from a struggle over Alexander's inheritance into a more conventional interstate competition for territory and influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. The assassination of Seleucus the Nicator by Ptolemy Coronis in 281 BC marked the end of the Diadochi generation and ushered in a new era of Hellenistic politics. The great successors who had fought over Alexander's inheritance were gone, replaced by their sons and grandsons, who inherited established kingdoms rather than carved territories from a crumbling empire. These second-generation rulers faced fundamentally different challenges: consolidating royal authority within defined borders, developing sustainable administrative systems, and creating cultural identities that could unite diverse populations under monarchical rule. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt emerged from this transition as perhaps the most successful of the successor kingdoms, having transformed what began as a military occupation into a sophisticated fusion of Macedonian royal traditions and ancient Egyptian pharaonic practices. Ptolemy preferred Soter's decision to establish his capital at Alexandria rather than Memphis, demonstrated his understanding that effective rule required more than simply adopting existing Persian administrative structures. The new city, positioned between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, became the physical embodiment of Hellenistic Egypt's unique character, Greek in its urban planning and intellectual culture, yet deeply connected to the agricultural wealth and religious traditions of the Nile Valley. Alexandria's development under the early Ptolemies represented an unprecedented experiment in urban planning and cultural synthesis. The city's grid pattern followed traditional Greek architectural principles, with wide boulevards intersecting at right angles and designated areas for different functions. The royal quarter occupied the eastern section, featuring the palace complex, administrative buildings, and the famous tomb of Alexander that served as both tourist attraction and symbol of Ptolemaic legitimacy. The museum and library, established under Ptolemy III and expanded by his successors, transformed Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean who came to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature under royal patronage. The Ptolemaic synthesis of Greek and Egyptian traditions extended far beyond architectural choices to encompass fundamental aspects of royal ideology and administrative practice. Ptolemy III's adoption of pharaonic titles and participation in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies provided legitimacy among the native population, while his maintenance of Macedonian military traditions and Greek cultural practices satisfied the needs of his colonist supporters. This dual identity required careful balancing, as excessive emphasis on either tradition risked alienating crucial constituencies within the kingdom. The administrative structure that emerged under the early Ptolemies reflected this cultural duality through its combination of Greek bureaucratic efficiency and Egyptian agricultural expertise. The kingdom was divided into nomes, traditional Egyptian administrative districts, each governed by a strategos who combined military command with civilian authority. These officials, typically drawn from the Greek and Macedonian settler population, worked alongside Egyptian priests and local administrators who possessed intimate knowledge of irrigation systems, tax collection procedures, and religious obligations that had governed Nile Valley agriculture for millennia. Ptolemaic economic policy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Egypt's unique advantages within the broader Hellenistic world. The kingdom's control over the Nile's annual flood cycle provided agricultural surpluses that could support both a large urban population in Alexandria and extensive export trade throughout the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies developed state monopolies over key industries including papyrus production, textile manufacturing and luxury goods, generating revenues that funded their military forces and cultural patronage while maintaining competitive advantages in international trade. The royal court at Alexandria developed elaborate ceremonial protocols that combined Macedonian traditions of military leadership with pharaonic concepts of divine kingship. Ptolemaic rulers appeared in public wearing both Greek diadems and Egyptian crowns, participated in both Macedonian army assemblies and Egyptian religious festivals, and issued coins bearing Greek inscriptions alongside hieroglyphic cartouches. This ceremonial complexity reflected the practical necessity of governing populations with fundamentally different expectations regarding royal behaviour and legitimacy. The Ptolemaic military system evolved to meet the specific challenges of defending Egypt's borders while maintaining internal control over a predominantly Egyptian population ruled by a Greek minority. The regular army combined traditional Macedonian phalanx units with Egyptian infantry trained in Greek fighting techniques, while the Royal Guard maintained exclusively Macedonian composition to ensure loyalty during potential domestic crises. The kingdom's naval forces, based at Alexandria and other Mediterranean ports, became the most formidable fleet in the Hellenistic world, protecting Egyptian commerce and projecting power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Marriage practices within the Ptolemaic dynasty reflected both practical political considerations and the influence of pharaonic traditions that differed significantly from Greek customs. Beginning with Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the dynasty adopted sibling marriage as standard practice, ensuring that royal bloodlines remained undiluted while concentrating wealth and authority within the immediate royal family. These marriages, while shocking to traditional Greek sensibilities, aligned with ancient Egyptian religious beliefs regarding pharaonic divinity and provided clear succession arrangements that minimized disputes among potential heirs. The Seleucid Empire faced fundamentally different challenges in establishing stable royal authority across territories that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of India. Unlike Egypt's geographical unity and cultural coherence, the Seleucid domains encompassed dozens of distinct peoples, languages, and religious traditions that had been loosely unified only through Persian administrative structures. Seleucus I Nicator's initial success in conquering these vast territories proved easier than developing sustainable methods for governing such diversity across enormous distances. The Seleucid administrative system that emerged under Antiochus the Soter represented a pragmatic adaptation of Persian satrapial structures to Greek political traditions. The empire was divided into large administrative units, each governed by a strategos or satrap, who possessed both military and civilian authority within his assigned territory. These officials, typically drawn from the Macedonian and Greek settler populations, maintained small garrisons in major cities while relying on local rulers and tribal leaders to implement royal policies in rural areas where direct control proved impractical. The challenges of governing such vast territories became apparent in the frequent rebellions and secessions that plagued the Seleucid Empire throughout its history. The eastern satrapies, separated from the Syrian heartland by months of difficult travel, gradually developed autonomous characteristics as local commanders found themselves forced to make independent decisions regarding military campaigns, taxation policies, and diplomatic relations with neighbouring powers. The emergence of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms and the Parthian Empire represented the most dramatic examples of this centrifugal tendency, but similar processes occurred throughout the Seleucid domains. Seleucid city-founding programs attempted to address these administrative challenges through the establishment of Greek settlements that could serve as centres of royal authority and Hellenistic culture throughout the empire. Cities like Antioch on the Orontes, Seleucia on the Tigris, and dozens of smaller foundations provided homes for Greek and Macedonian colonists, while creating networks of urban centres loyal to royal authority. These settlements typically received favourable tax treatment, judicial autonomy, and other privileges that encouraged immigration from the Greek homeland, while demonstrating the benefits of cooperation with Seleucid rule. The military organisation of the Seleucid Empire reflected both the diversity of its territories and the practical necessities of defending enormous frontiers against multiple enemies. The royal army combined traditional Macedonian units with cavalry forces drawn from various Iranian peoples, infantry contingents from Syrian and Mesopotamian cities, and specialised troops like war elephants, acquired through diplomatic relations with Indian kingdoms. This military diversity provided tactical flexibility, but created command challenges when units with different fighting traditions and languages attempted to coordinate during major campaigns. The restoration of Macedonian power under Antigonus II Gonatas required different strategies than those employed by the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties, as Macedonia's position as the homeland of Alexander's conquest created both advantages and constraints that other kingdoms did not face. Gonatas inherited territories that included not only Macedonia proper, but also varying degrees of influence over the Greek city-states that had provided the cultural and military foundations for Hellenistic expansion. His challenge lay in balancing Macedonian interests with the expectations of Greek cities that valued their traditional autonomy while requiring protection against external threats. The Macedonian monarchy under Gonatas developed institutional structures that preserved traditional relationships between king and army while adapting to the changed circumstances of the Hellenistic world. The king continued to lead military campaigns personally, maintaining the warrior traditions that had characterized Macedonian royalty since Philip II, but he also established a more sophisticated court hierarchy and administrative bureaucracy capable of managing complex diplomatic relationships with other Hellenistic kingdoms and Greek city-states. Gonatas' approach to governing the Greek city-states reflected his understanding that direct control would provoke resistance, while complete independence would eliminate Macedonian influence in Greek affairs. His system of garrisons in strategic locations like Corinth, Chalkis, and Piraeus provided military leverage when necessary, while his generally moderate policies regarding internal Greek affairs encouraged voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. This balance required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and different cities tested the limits of Macedonian tolerance for independent action. The cultural policies of the Antigonid dynasty emphasized Macedonia's role as the guardian of traditional Greek values against both barbarian threats and the cultural innovations emerging in other Hellenistic kingdoms. Gonatas and his successors patronized traditional Greek religious festivals, supported classical literary forms, and maintained court practices that emphasized continuity with the age of Philip and Alexander, rather than adaptation to Asian customs. This conservative approach provided stability and legitimacy within Macedonia, while distinguishing the kingdom from its more cosmopolitan rivals in Egypt and Asia. The emergence of smaller but significant kingdoms throughout the Hellenistic world demonstrated that political fragmentation had created opportunities for ambitious leaders who could exploit local advantages or fill power vacuums left by the major dynasties. The Attalid dynasty in Pergamon represented perhaps the most successful example of this phenomenon, as a family of relatively modest origins transformed a small city-state into a regional power that eventually rivaled the established kingdoms in wealth and cultural influence. The foundation of Attalid power lay in Pergamon's strategic location in northwestern Asia Minor, where the city controlled important trade routes while possessing natural defensive advantages that protected it from larger neighbours. Philetaerus, the dynasty's founder, had served as a subordinate commander under various Diadochi before establishing independent control over Pergamon and its surrounding territory. His successors expanded this modest beginning through careful diplomacy, military innovation, and economic policies that maximized the region's commercial potential. Attalid cultural patronage rivaled that of the major kingdoms, as the dynasty sought to establish legitimacy through association with Greek intellectual traditions and artistic achievements. The library at Pergamon became second only to Alexandria in its collection of manuscripts, while the city's architectural monuments demonstrated the dynasty's commitment to Hellenistic artistic standards. The famous Pergamon altar, with its dramatic sculptural depictions of mythological battles, exemplified the Attalid synthesis of traditional Greek themes with the grandeur expected of Hellenistic royal patronage. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms that emerged in the eastern regions of the former Seleucid Empire represented a unique experiment in Hellenistic state-building under conditions of extreme geographical isolation and cultural diversity. These kingdoms, established by Greek and Macedonian settlers who had accompanied Alexander's conquests or served in Seleucid armies, maintained Greek political institutions and cultural practices while adapting to local conditions that differed dramatically from Mediterranean environments. The success of Greco-Bactrian rulers in maintaining Greek identity while governing predominantly non-Greek populations demonstrated the adaptability of Hellenistic political structures under extreme conditions. Cities like Ai-Khanoum featured Greek architectural elements, gymnasia, and theatres alongside local building traditions and religious practices. The coinage produced by these kingdoms combined Greek artistic styles with local symbols and languages, creating visual representations of the cultural synthesis that characterized frontier Hellenistic societies. The Greek leagues that emerged during this period represented attempts by smaller city-states to maintain independence through collective action rather than submission to monarchical authority. The Achaean League, centered in the Peloponnese, developed federal institutions that allowed member cities to coordinate military and diplomatic policies while preserving local autonomy in internal affairs. The League's constitution balanced central authority with local independence through representative assemblies, rotating leadership positions, and carefully defined spheres of federal versus municipal jurisdiction. The Aetolian League, based in central Greece, adopted different organizational principles that reflected the more tribal character of its constituent communities. Aetolian federal institutions emphasized military cooperation and territorial expansion rather than the commercial and diplomatic concerns that dominated Achaean policy. The League's success in resisting Macedonian control and expanding into neighbouring regions demonstrated that alternative forms of political organization could compete effectively with monarchical systems under appropriate circumstances. These various political experiments, from the pharaonic Hellenistic synthesis of Ptolemaic Egypt to the federal institutions of the Greek leagues, established the fundamental patterns that would characterize the Hellenistic world for the next 2 centuries. Each kingdom and league developed distinctive solutions to the common challenges of governing diverse populations, maintaining military security and preserving Greek cultural identity while adapting to local conditions and external pressures. The establishment of stable royal dynasties across the Hellenistic world created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and transformation that extended far beyond the political boundaries of individual kingdoms. The process of Hellenization, the spread of Greek language, customs and institutions throughout the former Persian Empire, represented one of history's most significant cultural revolutions, fundamentally altering the intellectual and social landscape of the ancient world, while simultaneously transforming Greek culture itself through contact with diverse Eastern traditions. The foundation of Greek cities throughout the conquered territories served as the primary mechanism for spreading Hellenistic culture across vast geographical distances. Unlike the temporary military camps that had characterized earlier Greek expansion, these new settlements were designed as permanent urban centers that could sustain Greek cultural practices while serving as administrative and commercial hubs for their surrounding regions. Cities like Antioch on the Orontes, established by Seleucus I as his western capital, exemplified this urban planning approach through their systematic organisation around Greek institutional structures. Antioch's layout followed the grid pattern that had become standard for Hellenistic city planning, with broad colonnaded streets intersecting at right angles to create clearly defined districts for residential, commercial, and public functions. The city's agora occupied a central position, serving not merely as a marketplace but as the focal point for civic life where citizens gathered to conduct business, discuss politics, and participate in religious ceremonies. Surrounding the agora, architects constructed the essential buildings of Greek civic culture: the gymnasium where young men received their education, the theatre where dramatic performances reinforced cultural values, and the bouleuterion where city councils conducted their deliberations. The gymnasium system that spread throughout these new cities represented perhaps the most effective instrument of Hellenization among the urban populations of the former Persian Empire. These institutions combined physical education with intellectual training, creating comprehensive educational programs that transmitted Greek cultural values alongside practical skills. Young men from local elite families who attended these gymnasia learned to speak Greek fluently, studied Homer and other classical authors, participated in athletic competitions that reinforced Greek concepts of physical excellence, and absorbed political ideas about citizenship and civic responsibility that distinguished Greek culture from the monarchical traditions of their ancestors. The spread of Koine Greek as the lingua franca of commerce, administration, and intellectual discourse throughout the Hellenistic world facilitated communication across cultural boundaries while creating new forms of cultural synthesis. This simplified version of Attic Greek, stripped of many dialectical variations and enriched with vocabulary borrowed from local languages, became the common tongue of merchants conducting business from Spain to India, scholars exchanging ideas between Alexandria and Pergamon, and administrators implementing royal policies across diverse populations. The practical advantages of linguistic unity encouraged rapid adoption of Koine even in regions where Greek political control remained limited or temporary. The administrative requirements of governing multilingual populations accelerated the development of Greek educational systems throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms. Royal bureaucracies required literate officials capable of drafting documents, maintaining records, and conducting correspondence in Greek, creating demand for educational institutions that could train local populations in the language and administrative practices of their new rulers. These schools, often attached to gymnasia or temples, became centres for transmitting not only linguistic skills, but also Greek mathematical concepts, legal principles, and philosophical ideas that gradually influenced local intellectual traditions. The religious syncretism that characterized Hellenistic culture reflected the practical necessities of governing populations with diverse spiritual traditions, while maintaining the loyalty of Greek colonists who expected familiar deities and religious practices. Rather than attempting to impose Greek religious beliefs through force, Hellenistic rulers generally encouraged the identification of local deities with Greek gods who possessed similar attributes or functions. This process created new religious forms that combined Greek mythological narratives with local ritual practices, producing hybrid cults that could satisfy both Greek and indigenous religious sensibilities. The cult of Serapis, developed under the early Ptolemies, exemplified this syncretic approach through its deliberate combination of Greek and Egyptian religious elements, designed to appeal to both populations within Ptolemaic Egypt. The deity himself represented a fusion of Osiris, the traditional Egyptian god of the underworld, with Greek divine attributes associated with Zeus and Dionysus. Serapis possessed the bearded, mature appearance familiar from Greek representations of Zeus, but his cult incorporated Egyptian funerary practices and concepts of afterlife judgment that resonated with indigenous religious traditions. The god's primary temple, the Serapeum in Alexandria, featured Greek architectural elements, including Corinthian columns and marble sculptures, but its inner sanctuary contained Egyptian-style statuary and ritual objects that maintained connections to pharaonic religious practices. The iconography developed for Serapis demonstrated the sophisticated theological thinking that underlied Hellenistic religious syncretism. Artists depicted the god wearing a modius, a grain measure that symbolized agricultural abundance, on his head, connecting him to both Egyptian concepts of Nile fertility and Greek traditions of divine provision for human needs. His association with healing, prophecy, and protection of sailors made him attractive to Greek merchants and colonists, while his role as judge of the dead aligned with Egyptian beliefs about divine justice in the afterlife. This careful balancing of different religious traditions created a deity who could serve as a focus for shared worship between otherwise distinct cultural communities. Similar syncretic processes occurred throughout the Hellenistic world as local populations adapted Greek religious forms to accommodate their traditional beliefs. In Syria and Mesopotamia, ancient fertility goddesses acquired Greek names and mythological narratives while retaining their essential functions as protectors of agriculture and childbirth. Babylonian astronomical deities merged with Greek concepts of planetary influence, creating new forms of astrological practice that combined Greek mathematical precision with Eastern mystical traditions. These religious innovations reflected broader patterns of cultural exchange that transformed both Greek and local traditions through sustained contact and mutual influence. The development of Hellenistic art and architecture demonstrated how Greek aesthetic principles evolved through exposure to Eastern artistic traditions and the demands of royal patronage on an unprecedented scale. The classical restraint and idealized proportions that had characterized 5th century Athenian sculpture gave way to more dramatic expressions of emotion, movement, and individual personality that reflected both changing artistic tastes and the influence of non-Greek artistic traditions encountered throughout the conquered territories. The Colossus of Rhodes, constructed between 292 and 280 BC to commemorate the city's successful defence against Demetrius Poliorcetes, represented the new monumentality that characterized Hellenistic artistic achievements. Standing approximately 33 metres tall, the bronze statue of Helios dominated Rhodes's harbour entrance, visible to ships approaching from considerable distances across the Mediterranean. The sculpture's massive scale required innovative engineering techniques, including an internal iron framework and stone foundation that could support the bronze exterior while withstanding the seismic activity common to the Aegean region. Contemporary accounts describe the statue's realistic anatomical details and dynamic pose, with one arm raised to shield the god's eyes as he gazed across the sea toward the rising sun. The artistic program of the Colossus reflected sophisticated understanding of the statue's multiple functions as religious monument, civic symbol, and tourist attraction. Helios, as the patron deity of Rhodes, provided religious legitimacy for the monument, while the god's association with light and divine vision reinforced the city's role as a beacon of Greek culture in the Eastern Mediterranean. The statue's commanding presence served practical purposes by marking Rhodes's harbour for navigation, while demonstrating the city's wealth and artistic sophistication to visiting merchants and diplomats. The monument's fame spread throughout the ancient world, inspiring similar colossal statues in other Hellenistic cities and establishing new standards for royal and civic patronage of monumental art. The altar of Zeus at Pergamon, constructed during the reign of Eumenes II in the mid-2nd century BC, exemplified the emotional intensity and narrative complexity that distinguished Hellenistic sculpture from earlier Greek artistic traditions. The altar's frieze, depicting the mythological battle between gods and giants, covered approximately 120 metres of marble relief sculpture that surrounded the monument's base with scenes of divine combat rendered in unprecedented detail and dramatic force. Individual figures within the composition displayed intense facial expressions, dynamic body positions, and intricate drapery that created effects of movement and psychological tension far removed from the serene idealization of classical Greek sculpture. The iconographic program of the Pergamon altar served multiple political and cultural functions within the context of Attalid royal propaganda. The mythological narrative of divine victory over chaotic forces provided an allegory for Pergamon's military successes against Celtic invaders and other threats, while the altar's Greek mythological subject matter emphasized the dynasty's commitment to traditional Hellenic cultural values. The sculpture's technical excellence demonstrated Pergamene artistic sophistication, while its monumental scale proclaimed the kingdom's wealth and power to visitors from throughout the Hellenistic world. The realistic portraiture that emerged during the Hellenistic period reflected changing concepts of royal authority and individual identity that distinguished this era from earlier Greek artistic traditions. Rather than the idealized representations that had characterized classical sculpture, Hellenistic artists developed techniques for depicting specific facial features, expressions of personality, and signs of aging that created more psychologically complex portraits of rulers and prominent individuals. These innovations responded to the demands of royal patrons, who sought to project specific aspects of their character and authority through artistic representation. The portrait sculpture of rulers like Antiochus III of Syria or Ptolemy IV of Egypt displayed individualized features that conveyed particular aspects of royal personality, while maintaining the dignity expected of monarchical representation. Antiochus III's portraits emphasized his military achievements through determined facial expressions and heroic poses that recalled Alexander's iconography, while Ptolemaic royal portraits often incorporated Egyptian artistic elements that reinforced the dynasty's pharaonic legitimacy. These stylistic choices reflected sophisticated understanding of art's role in political communication within multicultural societies where visual symbols needed to convey meaning across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The interaction between Greek colonists and indigenous populations throughout the Hellenistic world created complex social dynamics that varied significantly based on local conditions, economic opportunities, and political circumstances. In Egypt, where Greek settlers concentrated primarily in Alexandria and other urban centres, intermarriage between Greek colonists and Egyptians occurred frequently among the middle classes, while remaining relatively rare among the highest levels of society. Ptolemaic administrative records reveal numerous families with mixed Greek and Egyptian ancestry who served in intermediate bureaucratic positions, suggesting that cultural assimilation proceeded most rapidly among groups with practical incentives for adopting Greek customs and language. The papyrus documents preserved in Egypt's dry climate provide detailed evidence of daily interactions between Greek and Egyptian communities in cities like Oxyrhynchus and Heracleopolis. Marriage contracts, business agreements, and legal disputes reveal patterns of cultural exchange that extended far beyond official government policies. Egyptian artisans adopted Greek artistic techniques while maintaining traditional religious subjects, creating hybrid art forms that appealed to both cultural communities. Greek merchants learned Egyptian agricultural practices and religious customs that proved useful for conducting business in rural areas, while Egyptian priests studied Greek philosophical concepts that could be incorporated into traditional theological discussions. The preservation of local traditions within Hellenistic frameworks occurred through various mechanisms that allowed indigenous populations to maintain cultural identity while participating in the broader Greek-dominated society. Egyptian temples continue to function according to traditional religious calendars and ritual practices, but their priests increasingly learned to read and write Greek in addition to hieroglyphic and demotic scripts. This linguistic competence enabled them to serve as intermediaries between Egyptian communities and Greek administrators, while their traditional religious authority provided legitimacy for new syncretic practices that combined Greek and Egyptian elements. In the Seleucid territories, the diversity of local populations created more complex patterns of cultural interaction than those found in Egypt's relatively unified society. Mesopotamian cities with long traditions of urban civilization adapted Greek institutional forms to existing social structures, creating hybrid governmental systems that combined Greek civic concepts with Babylonian administrative practices. The cuneiform tablets from Seleucia on the Tigris document the gradual adoption of Greek legal procedures alongside traditional Mesopotamian commercial customs, suggesting that cultural synthesis proceeded through practical accommodation rather than systematic replacement of existing practices. The mountain regions of Iran and Central Asia presented different challenges for Hellenistic cultural penetration, as tribal societies with strong military traditions proved more resistant to Greek influence than urban populations with established commercial relationships. Greek settlements in these areas typically remained isolated enclaves surrounded by largely unchanged indigenous communities, creating cultural boundaries that persisted for centuries after the initial conquests. However, even in these resistant regions, Greek coinage, artistic motifs, and technological innovations gradually influenced local practices through trade relationships and military service in Hellenistic armies. The role of women in facilitating cultural exchange throughout the Hellenistic world deserves particular attention, as marriage relationships created intimate connections between different cultural communities that extended far beyond formal diplomatic or commercial arrangements. Greek women who married local rulers or prominent indigenous men often served as cultural ambassadors who introduced Greek customs, religious practices, and artistic preferences into their new communities. Similarly, local women who married Greek colonists brought indigenous knowledge of agricultural techniques, religious traditions, and social customs that enriched Greek settler communities and facilitated their adaptation to new environments. The educational systems that developed in mixed communities created new forms of cultural synthesis that combined Greek pedagogical methods with local intellectual traditions. Schools in cities like Babylon taught Greek grammar and rhetoric alongside traditional Mesopotamian subjects like astronomy and mathematics, producing graduates who could function effectively in both cultural contexts. These educational innovations created a class of culturally bilingual individuals who served as interpreters, administrators, and cultural mediators throughout the Hellenistic world, facilitating communication and understanding between different ethnic communities within the same political structures. The cultural transformations that swept across the Hellenistic world found their most concentrated and revolutionary expression in Alexandria, where the Ptolemies created an unprecedented institution that would reshape human knowledge for centuries to come. The Museum and Library of Alexandria, established under Ptolemy I Soter around 295 BC and expanded dramatically under his successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, represented far more than royal patronage of learning. They constituted the world's first systematic attempt to collect, preserve, and advance human knowledge through coordinated scholarly research. The physical structure of the museum reflected its revolutionary purpose through architectural innovations that prioritized scholarly activity over traditional religious or ceremonial functions. Unlike earlier Greek temples or sanctuaries dedicated to the Muses, Alexandria's museum featured specialized spaces designed specifically for different types of intellectual work. Lecture halls with acoustic properties optimized for teaching mathematics and philosophy. Dissection rooms equipped with proper lighting and drainage for anatomical studies. Astronomical observation platforms positioned to provide clear views of celestial movements, and workshops where scholars could construct mechanical devices and test engineering principles. The library's collection methods demonstrated the Ptolemies' determination to acquire knowledge through any means necessary, including practices that would be considered piracy by modern standards. Royal agents stationed at Alexandria's harbour systematically confiscated manuscripts from every ship entering the port, copying the texts before returning the originals to their owners, though contemporary accounts suggest that visitors often received the copies while the originals remained in Alexandria's collection. Ptolemaic purchasing agents travelled throughout the Mediterranean world with enormous budgets to acquire rare manuscripts, often paying prices that exceeded the cost of luxury goods or military equipment. The systematic organisation of Alexandria's scholarly community created new forms of intellectual collaboration that transcended traditional boundaries between different fields of study. Rather than working in isolation as most earlier Greek thinkers had done, Alexandrian scholars participated in regular discussions, shared research materials, and built upon each other's discoveries in ways that accelerated the pace of intellectual advancement. The museum's residential quarters housed dozens of scholars simultaneously, creating a concentrated community of researchers who could exchange ideas daily while pursuing their individual specializations. Euclid's arrival in Alexandria during the early years of Ptolemy I's reign marked the beginning of the institution's golden age of mathematical achievement. His systematic approach to geometric principles, culminating in the elements, represented a fundamental departure from earlier Greek mathematical practice through its rigorous logical structure and comprehensive treatment of geometric relationships. Rather than presenting mathematical knowledge as a collection of isolated techniques for solving practical problems, Euclid organized geometric principles into a coherent logical system where each theorem built upon previous demonstrations to create an integrated understanding of spatial relationships. The elements consisted of 13 books that progressed from basic definitions and postulates through increasingly complex geometric proofs, culminating in the construction of the 5 regular solids that would later be called Platonic solids. Euclid's method of beginning each proof with clearly stated assumptions and proceeding through logical steps to reach inevitable conclusions established standards of mathematical rigour that influenced not only geometry but all subsequent scientific thinking. His famous parallel postulate that through any point not on a given line, exactly one line can be drawn parallel to the given line, would puzzle mathematicians for over 2 millennia before the development of non-Euclidean geometries in the 19th century. The practical applications of Euclidean geometry extended far beyond abstract mathematical theory to encompass architecture, engineering, astronomy, and military science throughout the Hellenistic world. Architects used Euclidean principles to design buildings with precise proportions and structural stability, while engineers applied geometric calculations to construct aqueducts, bridges, and siege engines that required accurate measurements across long distances. Military commanders employed geometric principles to calculate optimal positions for artillery placement and to design fortifications that could withstand systematic assault. Archimedes of Syracuse, though not permanently resident in Alexandria, maintained extensive correspondence with Alexandrian mathematicians and visited the museum frequently enough to participate in its collaborative research environment. His innovations in both theoretical mathematics and practical engineering demonstrated the potential for combining abstract reasoning with empirical observation to achieve unprecedented technological capabilities. Archimedes' discovery of the principle of buoyancy, according to Vitruvius, occurred when he noticed water overflowing from his bath and realized that the volume of displaced water equaled the volume of the submerged object, a revelation that led to his famous exclamation "Eureka!". The mathematical foundations underlying Archimedes' engineering achievements included sophisticated understanding of leverage, pulley systems, and the geometric properties of curves and surfaces. His work on the mathematics of the spiral led to practical applications in the design of the Archimedes screw, a device for raising water that found widespread use throughout the Hellenistic world for irrigation and drainage projects. His calculations regarding the area and volume of spheres, cylinders, and other geometric solids provided essential tools for architects and engineers who needed to determine material requirements and structural loads for large construction projects. Archimedes' military engineering during the Roman siege of Syracuse in 212 BC demonstrated how Alexandrian mathematical principles could be applied to warfare with devastating effectiveness. His defensive innovations included compound pulley systems capable of lifting entire ships out of the water, catapults with precisely calculated ranges that could strike targets at unprecedented distances, and focusing mirrors that allegedly concentrated sunlight to ignite Roman vessels. While some ancient accounts of these devices may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms that Archimedes developed sophisticated mechanical systems that gave Syracuse's defenders significant advantages over conventionally equipped Roman forces. The astronomical achievements of Hellenistic scholars built upon Babylonian observational data and Egyptian calendar systems, while applying Greek mathematical methods to create unprecedented understanding of celestial mechanics. Aristarchus of Samos, working in the early 3rd century BC, developed the first known heliocentric model of the solar system, proposing that the Earth and other planets orbited around the Sun rather than the geocentric system that had dominated earlier Greek astronomy. His calculations of the relative sizes and distances of the Sun and Moon, while not entirely accurate due to limitations in ancient observational instruments, demonstrated mathematical techniques that would remain fundamental to astronomical calculation for centuries. Hipparchus of Nicaea, often considered the greatest astronomer of antiquity, made systematic observations from Rhodes and Alexandria that revolutionized understanding of stellar positions and planetary movements. His discovery of the precession of the equinoxes, the gradual shift in the orientation of Earth's rotational axis, required decades of careful observation and comparison with earlier Babylonian records. Hipparchus developed the first comprehensive star catalogue, identifying the positions and relative brightness of over 800 stars, and invented the magnitude system for describing stellar brightness that remains in use today. The most famous astronomical achievement of the Hellenistic period belonged to Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as head librarian at Alexandria during the mid-3rd century BC. His calculation of Earth's circumference represented a masterpiece of applied mathematics that combined careful observation with geometric reasoning to achieve remarkable accuracy. Eratosthenes noticed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in Syene, casting no shadow, while simultaneously casting a shadow at Alexandria that measured approximately 7 degrees from vertical. Using the known distance between Alexandria and Siena, approximately 800 kilometers, Eratosthenes applied geometric principles to calculate that if 7 degrees represented the angular difference between the two cities, then the full 360-degree circumference of Earth must be roughly 40,000 kilometers. His actual calculation yielded a result of approximately 39,350 kilometers, representing an error of less than 2% from the modern accepted value of 40,075 kilometers. This achievement demonstrated not only individual brilliance, but also the collaborative nature of Alexandrian scholarship, as Eratosthenes relied on distance measurements provided by royal surveyors and astronomical observations recorded by other scholars. The medical advances achieved at Alexandria built upon earlier Greek anatomical knowledge, while benefiting from Egyptian embalming practices that had provided detailed understanding of internal organ structure and function. Herophilus of Chalcedon, working under the early Ptolemies, conducted systematic dissections of human corpses, a practice that had been forbidden in classical Greece, but was permitted in Alexandria due to different cultural attitudes toward the treatment of dead bodies. His anatomical investigations led to the discovery of the nervous system structure, including the distinction between sensory and motor nerves, and detailed descriptions of the heart's valves and the brain's ventricles. Erasistratus of CEOs, a contemporary of Herophilus, focused his research on physiological processes rather than purely anatomical structure. His investigations of blood circulation, while not achieving complete understanding of the cardiovascular system, identified the function of heart valves in preventing blood from flowing backward and recognized that arteries and veins served different functions in transporting blood throughout the body. Erasistratus also studied digestion, respiration, and muscular contraction, developing theories about bodily functions that represented significant advances over earlier Greek medical knowledge. The pharmacological research conducted at Alexandria combined traditional Egyptian knowledge of medicinal plants with systematic Greek approaches to testing and documenting therapeutic effects. Alexandrian physicians compiled extensive catalogues of drugs derived from local and imported plants, minerals, and animal products, recording their effects on various diseases and medical conditions. These pharmaceutical investigations required collaboration between physicians, botanists, and chemists who worked together to identify active compounds and develop standardized preparations that could be reproduced reliably. The philosophical schools that emerged during the Hellenistic period reflected the changed political and social conditions that followed Alexander's conquests and the establishment of monarchical governments throughout the former Persian Empire. Unlike the earlier Greek philosophical traditions that had developed within the context of small, independent city-states where citizens could participate directly in political decision-making, Hellenistic philosophy addressed the needs of individuals living under royal authority in large cosmopolitan societies where personal agency in public affairs was severely limited. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC, represented the most systematic response to these new conditions through its emphasis on personal virtue and emotional self-control as the foundations of human happiness. Zeno established his school in the Painted Stoa in Athens, where he taught that virtue was the only true good and that external circumstances, wealth, political power, social status, even physical health, were indifferent matters that could not affect genuine human well-being. This philosophical position provided psychological comfort to individuals who lived under political systems where their personal circumstances could change dramatically due to factors beyond their control. The Stoic physics developed by Zeno and his successors provided a materialist foundation for their ethical teachings through the doctrine that the universe consisted entirely of matter in various states of tension and organization. According to Stoic cosmology, divine reason pervaded all matter and guided the development of natural processes according to rational principles that could be understood through philosophical investigation. This worldview implied that human beings, as rational creatures, could achieve happiness by aligning their desires and actions with the rational order of the universe, rather than struggling against circumstances they could not change. Cleanthes of Assos, Zeno's successor as head of the Stoic school, developed the religious implications of Stoic philosophy through his famous Hymn to Zeus, which identified the supreme deity with the rational principle governing the universe. This theological innovation allowed Stoics to maintain traditional religious practices while interpreting them according to philosophical principles that emphasized reason rather than superstition. Cleanthes' integration of religious devotion with rational philosophy provided a model for educated Greeks who sought to reconcile their intellectual commitments with their cultural heritage. Chrysippus of Soli, the third head of the Stoic school, systematized Stoic logic and ethics through hundreds of treatises that established the philosophical foundations for later Roman Stoic thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. His logical investigations included development of propositional logic and analysis of conditional statements that influenced subsequent philosophical and mathematical reasoning. Chrysippus's ethical writings emphasize the practical application of Stoic principles to daily life. providing detailed guidance for maintaining virtue under various challenging circumstances. Epicureanism, established by Epicurus in Athens around 307 BC, offered an alternative philosophical response to Hellenistic political conditions through its emphasis on pleasure as the highest good and its recommendation of withdrawal from public life to focus on personal relationships and intellectual pursuits. The Garden, Epicurus's philosophical community, welcomed both men and women as participants in philosophical discussions and provided a model for voluntary association based on friendship rather than political or family obligations. The Epicurean understanding of pleasure differed significantly from popular misconceptions that associated the school with sensual indulgence or hedonistic excess. Epicurus distinguished between kinetic pleasures, active enjoyments that involved movement and stimulation, and katastematic pleasures, stable states of satisfaction and tranquility that could be maintained indefinitely without external reinforcement. He argued that katastematic pleasures were superior because they did not depend on circumstances beyond individual control and could not be disrupted by political upheavals or social changes. Epicurean physics, based on Democritus's atomic theory, supported the school's ethical teachings by explaining natural phenomena without reference to divine intervention or supernatural causation. According to Epicurean atomism, all matter consisted of indivisible particles moving through void space according to natural laws that could be understood through observation and reasoning. This materialist worldview eliminated fear of divine punishment or arbitrary supernatural interference in human affairs, allowing individuals to make rational decisions about their conduct without concern for unpredictable divine responses. The Epicurean attitude toward death represented perhaps the school's most distinctive contribution to Hellenistic thought, through the famous maxim, "Death is nothing to us." Epicurus argued that since sensation required the interaction of atomic particles within a living body, death, which involved the dispersal of these particles, could not involve any form of conscious experience. This reasoning eliminated fear of posthumous punishment or suffering while encouraging individuals to focus their attention on achieving happiness during their actual lifetimes, rather than worrying about unknowable future states. Skepticism, developed by Pyrrho of Elis and systematized by later thinkers like Sextus Empiricus, offered a third philosophical response to Hellenistic conditions through its recommendation of epoche, suspension of judgment regarding questions that could not be resolved through reliable evidence or reasoning. Pyrrhonian skeptics argued that dogmatic commitment to particular beliefs about metaphysical or ethical questions led to unnecessary anxiety and conflict, while suspension of judgment produced ataraxia, tranquility of mind that allowed individuals to navigate daily life without the distress caused by philosophical disputes. The skeptical investigation of knowledge claims involved systematic examination of the criteria used to distinguish reliable from unreliable beliefs. Skeptics developed elaborate arguments demonstrating that sensory experience, rational demonstration, and authoritative testimony all contained potential sources of error that made absolute certainty impossible. Rather than concluding that knowledge was entirely impossible, however, most skeptics recommended relying on appearances and practical considerations while avoiding dogmatic claims about the ultimate nature of reality. The literary innovations of the Hellenistic period reflected both the changed social conditions of the post-Alexander world and the influence of royal patronage on artistic production. Unlike the classical period, when dramatic and epic poetry had been performed at religious festivals for entire civic communities, Hellenistic literature was often created for smaller, more educated audiences who appreciated sophisticated literary techniques and scholarly references. This shift toward learned poetry required authors to develop new forms of artistic expression that could satisfy the expectations of cultured readers while maintaining the emotional power of earlier Greek literary traditions. Theocritus of Syracuse, working under Ptolemaic patronage in Alexandria during the early 3rd century BC, created the pastoral genre through his Idylls, short poems that depicted the lives of shepherds and rural inhabitants with unprecedented realism and psychological depth. Rather than idealising country life as a golden age alternative to urban corruption, Theocritus presented rural characters as complex individuals with their own desires, conflicts, and social relationships. His shepherds discussed poetry and philosophy, competed in singing contests, and experienced romantic disappointments that paralleled the emotional experiences of urban readers. The technical innovations in Theocritus's poetry included sophisticated use of dialect variation to characterize different speakers, complex metrical patterns that enhanced the musical qualities of his verses, and literary allusions that demonstrated his mastery of earlier Greek poetic traditions. His influence extended throughout the Hellenistic world and later Roman literature, establishing pastoral poetry as a major literary genre that would continue to develop for centuries after his death. Apollonius of Rhodes attempted to revive epic poetry for Hellenistic audiences through his Argonautica, a 4-book epic recounting Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece. Unlike Homer's epics, which had focused on heroic action and divine intervention, Apollonius emphasized psychological analysis and romantic relationships, particularly the love story between Jason and Medea that occupies much of the poem's final books. His treatment of Medea's internal conflict between passion and duty represented a sophisticated exploration of human psychology that reflected contemporary interest in individual emotional experience. The scholarly apparatus surrounding Apollonius's epic included extensive geographical research regarding the route of the Argonauts' journey and detailed knowledge of various local traditions and religious practices encountered during their travels. This learned approach to epic composition reflected the influence of Alexandrian scholarship on literary production, as poets were expected to demonstrate familiarity with historical, geographical, and mythological sources that went far beyond the traditional knowledge required for earlier Greek poetry. Menander of Athens revolutionized comic theatre through his development of new comedy, which replaced the political satire and fantastic situations of Aristophanic old comedy, with realistic domestic situations involving recognizable character types. Menander's plays typically featured young lovers whose romantic relationships were complicated by social obstacles, clever slaves who devised elaborate schemes to help their masters, and stern fathers whose initial opposition eventually gave way to acceptance of their children's choices. These conventional plot patterns provided frameworks for sophisticated character development and social commentary that appealed to audiences throughout the Hellenistic world. The influence of new comedy extended far beyond its immediate theatrical context to shape subsequent dramatic literature and social attitudes throughout the ancient world. Menander's realistic portrayal of family relationships, his sympathetic treatment of slaves and other marginalized characters, and his emphasis on the ultimate triumph of love over social convention provided models for later Roman comedians like Plautus and Terence, whose adaptations of Greek New Comedy introduced these themes to Western European literary traditions. The consolidation of royal power across the Hellenistic kingdoms by 281 BC created unprecedented conditions for economic expansion that would transform the ancient world's commercial landscape. The establishment of stable political boundaries, standardized administrative systems, and secure transportation routes facilitated trade on a scale that dwarfed earlier Greek commercial activities. From the bustling harbours of Alexandria to the caravan terminals of Bactria, a vast network of interconnected markets emerged that linked the Atlantic shores of Spain with the spice ports of India, creating the world's first truly global economy. The Mediterranean Sea, which had served primarily as a barrier between different cultural regions during the classical period, became the central highway of Hellenistic commerce. Royal navies maintained regular patrols that suppressed piracy and protected merchant vessels, carrying grain from Egypt, wine from Rhodes, olive oil from Syria, and manufactured goods from various urban centres throughout the Greek world. The Ptolemaic fleet based at Alexandria, and supplemented by smaller squadrons at Cyrenaica and Cyprus, dominated the eastern Mediterranean trade routes while maintaining diplomatic relationships with independent maritime powers like Rhodes that controlled crucial shipping lanes between Asia Minor and Egypt. The expansion of trade networks beyond the Mediterranean required systematic development of overland routes that could handle the massive caravans necessary for profitable long-distance commerce. The Seleucid Empire's control over the traditional Persian road system provided the foundation for this expansion, but Hellenistic merchants and administrators made significant improvements to accommodate increased traffic volumes and new types of cargo. The royal road that connected Seleucia on the Tigris with the Mediterranean ports of Antioch and Seleucia Pieria was widened to allow multiple caravans to pass simultaneously, equipped with regularly spaced way stations that provided fresh animals and supplies and protected by garrison troops stationed at strategic intervals. These overland trade routes extended far beyond the formal boundaries of Hellenistic kingdoms to reach markets in Central Asia, India, and eventually China. Merchants from Greek cities in Bactria established regular commercial relationships with Indian kingdoms that provided access to precious stones, spices, silk, and other luxury goods highly valued in Mediterranean markets. The profits from this trade were so substantial that individual merchant families could accumulate wealth, rivaling that of minor royalty, while the customs duties collected by royal governments provided significant portions of their total revenues. The development of Antioch on the Orontes as the western capital of the Seleucid Empire exemplified the systematic urban planning that characterized Hellenistic commercial centers. Seleucus I personally supervised the city's initial layout, positioning it approximately 25 kilometers inland from the Mediterranean coast, to provide protection from naval attacks while maintaining access to maritime trade through the port of Seleucia Pieria. The Orontes River provided a natural transportation route that connected the city to inland Syrian territories while offering sufficient water flow to support large urban populations and industrial activities. The city's commercial district occupied a central position within Antioch's grid pattern, featuring covered markets that protected merchants and customers from Syria's intense summer heat while providing secure storage for valuable goods. These markets were organized according to the types of merchandise sold, with separate areas for textiles, metalwork, spices, and other specialized products. The concentration of similar businesses in designated areas facilitated price comparison and quality assessment, while creating competitive pressures that encouraged innovation and efficiency among merchants and artisans. The architectural monuments constructed in Antioch during this period reflected both the city's prosperity and its role as a centre of Hellenistic culture. The royal palace complex, built on an island in the Orontes River, featured gardens, libraries and reception halls designed to impress visiting dignitaries and demonstrate Seleucid wealth and sophistication. The city's theatre, capable of seating over 30,000 spectators, hosted dramatic performances, musical competitions, and public assemblies that reinforced Greek cultural identity, while providing entertainment for the diverse urban population. Seleucia on the Tigris represented an even more ambitious urban development project, as Seleucus I created an entirely new city to serve as his eastern capital and administrative centre for the former Persian heartland. The city's location on the Tigris River, approximately 30 kilometers north of ancient Babylon, provided access to the extensive canal systems that had supported Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia, while connecting to trade routes that extended throughout the Iranian plateau and beyond to Central Asia and India. The construction of Seleucia on the Tigris required massive engineering projects that demonstrated the technological capabilities available to Hellenistic rulers with sufficient resources and administrative expertise. The city's foundations were built on artificial platforms that raised the urban area above the Tigris's seasonal flood levels, while providing drainage systems that could handle the heavy runoff from Mesopotamian thunderstorms. The harbour facilities included stone quays capable of accommodating the largest river vessels used for bulk cargo transportation, along with warehouse complexes that could store grain, textiles and other goods awaiting shipment to distant markets. The administrative buildings, constructed in Seleucia on the Tigris, reflected the complex governmental requirements of managing territories that included dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, and legal traditions. The royal chancellery occupied a massive complex that housed hundreds of scribes, translators, and record keepers who maintained correspondence with governors throughout the Seleucid Empire, while processing the vast quantities of documentation required for tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration. These bureaucratic activities required standardized procedures and forms that could be understood by officials throughout the empire regardless of their local origins or native languages. The economic integration achieved through these urban centres extended to the development of sophisticated monetary systems that facilitated commercial transactions across vast distances and between different political jurisdictions. The Ptolemaic kingdom established mints at Alexandria, Cyrenaica, and other major cities that produced silver and gold coins according to standardized weight and purity specifications that were accepted by merchants throughout the Mediterranean world. These coins featured portraits of Ptolemaic rulers alongside Greek inscriptions and Egyptian symbols that reinforced royal authority while providing practical information about the currency's value and origin. The Seleucid monetary system faced more complex challenges due to the empire's vast territorial extent and diverse population, but it achieved remarkable success in creating currency that could function effectively from Syria to Bactria. Royal mints at Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Ecbatana, and other major cities produced coins that maintained consistent silver content and weight standards, while incorporating local artistic elements that made them acceptable to regional populations. The tetradrachm became the standard denomination for large commercial transactions, while smaller bronze coins served the needs of daily retail trade in urban markets. The standardization of coinage across different kingdoms required diplomatic agreements and commercial treaties that established exchange rates and mutual acceptance arrangements. Merchants conducting business between Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria could exchange currencies at known rates without the uncertainty that had plagued earlier Greek commercial relationships. These monetary arrangements reduced transaction costs while increasing the volume of trade that could be conducted profitably across political boundaries. Banking innovations developed during this period provided credit mechanisms that enabled merchants to finance long-distance trading ventures without carrying large quantities of precious metal across dangerous routes. Ptolemaic banks in Alexandria developed letters of credit that could be honoured by corresponding institutions in Rhodes, Delos, and other commercial centres, allowing merchants to deposit funds in one location and withdraw equivalent amounts at their destinations. These financial instruments reduced the risks associated with transporting valuable cargo, while providing banks with profitable opportunities to invest deposited funds in other commercial ventures. The temple banks that operated throughout the Hellenistic world combined religious functions with commercial services in ways that provided both practical benefits and spiritual legitimacy for their financial activities. The Temple of Apollo at Delos became one of the most important banking centres in the Aegean Sea, offering secure storage for merchants' funds while maintaining detailed records of deposits, loans, and currency exchanges. The religious sanctuary provided protection against theft and political confiscation that made temple banks more secure than purely commercial institutions, while the gods' supposed oversight of financial transactions encouraged honest dealing among depositors and borrowers. Agricultural innovations implemented throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms provided the foundation for urban prosperity through increased food production and rural specialization that supported larger non-agricultural populations. The Ptolemaic administration of Egypt's Nile Valley agriculture represented the most systematic approach to land management, combining traditional Egyptian irrigation techniques with Greek administrative efficiency to achieve unprecedented agricultural productivity. Royal engineers supervised the maintenance and expansion of canal systems that distributed Nile floodwaters across the valley's agricultural areas, while drainage projects reclaimed marshy areas for cultivation. The clerouchic system, developed by the Ptolemies, provided land grants to Greek and Macedonian military veterans in exchange for continued military service when required by royal authorities. These settlements created networks of loyal colonists throughout Egypt who served as local administrators and military reservists while introducing Greek agricultural techniques and crops to Egyptian farming communities. The clerus received plots of varying sizes depending on their military rank and length of service, with cavalry veterans typically receiving larger grants than infantry soldiers. The integration of Greek settlers with Egyptian agricultural communities proceeded through various mechanisms that balanced the needs of both populations while maximizing productive efficiency. Greek clerics learned Egyptian irrigation techniques and crop rotation patterns that had been developed over thousands of years of Nile Valley agriculture, while Egyptian farmers adopted Greek tools and livestock breeds that improved their agricultural output. The royal administration encouraged this technological exchange through tax incentives and technical assistance that benefited both groups while increasing overall agricultural productivity. The specialized agricultural regions that developed during this period reflected both natural advantages and market demands that encouraged farmers to focus on particular crops or livestock rather than attempting to achieve complete self-sufficiency. The wine-producing regions of Rhodes, Chios and other Greek islands developed distinctive varieties that commanded premium prices in urban markets throughout the Hellenistic world. Egyptian papyrus production became a virtual monopoly that provided the Ptolemies with substantial export revenues while supplying the writing material essential for the expanded bureaucratic activities of all Hellenistic kingdoms. The olive oil production centered in Syria and Palestine supplied markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean while providing raw materials for soap manufacturing, lamp fuel, and other industrial uses that supported urban populations. The systematic cultivation of olive groves required long-term investments that were only profitable under stable political conditions, demonstrating the economic benefits of the peace and security maintained by Hellenistic royal governments. Textile production emerged as one of the most important industrial activities in Hellenistic cities, combining local raw materials with imported luxury fibers to create products that range from everyday clothing to elaborate ceremonial garments. Alexandria's textile workshops processed Egyptian flax into linen fabrics that were exported throughout the Mediterranean world, while also importing silk from Central Asia and India that was woven into luxury textiles for wealthy customers. The technical knowledge required for silk production remained closely guarded by Chinese manufacturers, but Hellenistic merchants developed extensive trade networks that brought these precious materials to Mediterranean markets despite the enormous distances and transportation costs involved. The metalworking industries that developed in various Hellenistic cities reflected both local mineral resources and the technical expertise of craftsmen who brought specialized knowledge from their native regions. The silver mines of Attica continued to provide raw materials for Athenian coinage, while new mining operations in Spain, Thrace and other regions supplied the increased demand for precious metals created by expanded trade and monetary systems. The copper mines of Cyprus provided materials for bronze production that supplied both military needs and civilian markets for tools, cookware and decorative objects. The shipbuilding industry became increasingly sophisticated as the demands of long-distance trade required vessels capable of carrying larger cargoes across greater distances while maintaining reasonable speeds and maneuverability. The grain ships that transported Egyptian wheat to other Mediterranean markets were among the largest vessels constructed in antiquity, with some examples reportedly capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of cargo. These massive ships required advanced engineering techniques for hull construction and rigging systems that could handle the stresses of ocean sailing while providing sufficient cargo capacity to make long-distance grain transport profitable. The harbour facilities constructed to accommodate these larger vessels represented major engineering achievements that required substantial investments by royal governments and commercial organisations. The lighthouse at Alexandria, completed around 280 BC, stood approximately 120 metres tall and provided navigation assistance visible from distances of up to 50 kilometres at sea. The structure's three-stage design featured a square base, octagonal middle section, and cylindrical top section that housed the beacon fire, while interior ramps allowed fuel to be transported to the upper levels. The lighthouse's fame spread throughout the ancient world, inspiring similar constructions at other major ports while establishing Alexandria's reputation as the premier commercial centre of the eastern Mediterranean. The revolt of Diodotus against Seleucid authority around 250 BC marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable experiments in Hellenistic state-building, as Greek and Macedonian settlers in the remote regions of Bactria and Sogdiana established independent kingdoms that would endure for over 2 centuries in the face of extraordinary geographical and cultural challenges. The circumstances that enabled this secession reflected the fundamental weaknesses in Seleucid imperial administration that became apparent as the empire struggled to maintain effective control over territories separated from the Syrian heartland by thousands of kilometres of difficult terrain and hostile populations. Diodotus I, who had served as Seleucid satrap of Bactria since approximately 260 BC, possessed the military resources and administrative infrastructure necessary to challenge royal authority due to his position commanding the empire's eastern frontier against nomadic incursions from Central Asia. His satrapy controlled the vital trade routes that connected the Hellenistic world with India and China, generating customs revenues that could support substantial military forces while providing access to luxury goods that commanded enormous prices in Mediterranean markets. The wealth derived from this commercial position, combined with the practical impossibility of rapid communication with Antioch, created conditions that made successful rebellion feasible for a capable and ambitious governor. The initial stages of Diodotus's revolt proceeded with careful attention to maintaining the loyalty of Greek colonists and indigenous populations, whose cooperation was essential for establishing an independent kingdom. Rather than simply declaring independence and hoping for the best, Diodotus implemented administrative reforms that addressed local grievances while preserving the essential structures of Hellenistic government that had proven effective in managing diverse populations. He retained Greek as the language of official business, while permitting local languages to be used in regional administration, maintained Seleucid legal codes while allowing traditional customs to govern family and religious matters, and continued the practice of appointing Greek officials to key positions while incorporating qualified locals into lower administrative ranks. The military organisation of the nascent Greco-Bactrian kingdom reflected the unique challenges of defending territories that bordered both settled agricultural regions and the vast steppes inhabited by nomadic peoples whose military capabilities differed fundamentally from those of traditional Hellenistic enemies. Diodotus inherited Seleucid garrison troops that included Macedonian phalanx units, Greek cavalry squadrons, and various auxiliary forces recruited from local populations. But he quickly recognized that this conventional military structure required modification to address the tactical problems posed by highly mobile nomadic warriors who could appear suddenly at any point along his extensive frontiers. The adaptation of Greek military techniques to Central Asian conditions involved incorporating elements of nomadic warfare, while maintaining the disciplined formations that had proven effective in Mediterranean conflicts. Bactrian cavalry units learned to fight as mounted archers in addition to their traditional role as heavy cavalry, developing the ability to conduct the rapid advances and retreats that characterize steppe warfare while retaining their capacity for decisive shock action when circumstances permitted. Infantry formations were modified to provide greater mobility and flexibility, with lighter equipment and more open formations that could respond quickly to changing tactical situations without sacrificing the coordinated action that distinguished Greek military units from barbarian war bands. The establishment of Bactra as the capital of the independent kingdom required substantial construction projects that demonstrated royal authority, while providing the administrative facilities necessary for governing territories that extended from the Oxus River to the Hindu Kush Mountains. The city's existing Hellenistic infrastructure, originally established during Alexander's conquests and expanded under Seleucid administration, provided a foundation for these developments. But Diodotus's architects and engineers made significant modifications that reflected both the kingdom's independent status and its unique cultural position between the Greek and Iranian worlds. The royal palace complex constructed at Bactra combined traditional Greek architectural elements with local building techniques adapted to Central Asian climate conditions. Colonnaded courtyards provided the formal spaces required for royal ceremonies and diplomatic receptions, while residential quarters featured the thick walls and small windows necessary for protection against the region's extreme temperature variations. The palace's defensive features included high walls, fortified gates, and strategic positioning that allowed the royal guard to control access to the city's central districts while maintaining escape routes that could be used if nomadic attacks overwhelmed the outer defences. The coinage issued by Diodotus III and his successors provided crucial evidence for the political and cultural evolution of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, as royal mints produced silver and gold pieces that combined Greek artistic traditions with local symbols and inscriptions designed to appeal to diverse populations within the kingdom. The earliest diadoted coins featured traditional Greek portraits of the king wearing a diadem, accompanied by Greek inscriptions that proclaimed his royal titles and divine associations. However, these issues also incorporated Bactrian and Persian design elements that acknowledged the kingdom's Asian character while maintaining its Hellenistic identity. The reverse designs of Greco-Bactrian coins demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the symbolic language required to communicate royal authority across cultural boundaries. Zeus, the traditional patron deity of Greek royalty, appeared frequently but was often depicted with attributes that connected him to local religious traditions. Heracles, another popular figure on Greco-Bactrian coinage, was portrayed in ways that emphasized his role as a divine hero who had travelled to the ends of the earth, making him an appropriate symbol for Greek rulers governing remote territories far from the Mediterranean homeland. The development of Greco-Bactrian administrative systems required careful balancing of Greek institutional traditions with the practical necessities of governing populations that included Iranian farmers, nomadic pastoralists, and various tribal groups whose political structures differed significantly from those familiar to Greek colonists. The kingdom's legal system maintained Greek principles for matters involving Greek citizens while permitting traditional laws to govern disputes within indigenous communities. This dual legal structure required judges who could navigate between different legal traditions, while maintaining the consistency necessary for effective governance. Tax collection in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom presented complex challenges due to the diverse economic activities practiced by different population groups within the royal territories. Greek cities paid taxes in silver coin according to traditional Hellenistic practice, while Iranian agricultural communities typically provided payments in grain and other agricultural products. Nomadic groups contributed livestock, hides, and military service rather than monetary payments, requiring administrative systems capable of managing these various forms of tribute while converting them into resources useful for royal purposes. The expansion of Greco-Bactrian power into Indian territories under Demetrius I, around 200 BC, represented a dramatic escalation of Greek ambitions that would create new opportunities and challenges for the Eastern kingdoms. Demetrius's invasion of the Indus Valley exploited the political fragmentation that had followed the collapse of Mauryan power in northern India, where local rulers competed for control over wealthy urban centres and agricultural regions that could provide the resources necessary for maintaining large armies and sophisticated administrative systems. The military campaigns that established Greek control over Gandhara and other northwestern Indian regions required tactical adaptations that went beyond those developed for Central Asian warfare. Indian armies included war elephants, whose psychological and physical impact on troops unfamiliar with these animals could prove decisive in battle. Greek commanders learned to counter elephant charges through the use of specialized anti-elephant devices including iron-tipped stakes, flaming projectiles, and coordinated missile attacks that could wound or panic the animals before they reached Greek formations. The siege warfare required for capturing Indian cities presented technical challenges that tested the engineering capabilities of Greek military forces operating far from their supply bases. Indian fortifications often featured massive stone walls, complex gate systems, and water supplies that could sustain long sieges, requiring Greek commanders to develop new approaches to assault and blockade tactics. The successful capture of cities like Taxila and Pushkalavati demonstrated that Greek military technology and organizational skills could overcome these obstacles. But the campaigns also revealed the substantial resources required for sustained operations in unfamiliar territories. The establishment of Indo-Greek kingdoms in the conquered Indian territories created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange between Greek and Indian civilizations. Unlike the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, where Greek colonists governed primarily Iranian and nomadic populations with limited urban traditions, the Indo-Greek rulers found themselves administering sophisticated societies with ancient literary traditions, complex religious systems, and established commercial networks that extended throughout the subcontinent and beyond to Southeast Asia. The city of Taxila, which served as a major administrative centre for Indo-Greek rule, exemplified the cultural synthesis that emerged in these frontier kingdoms. The city's existing infrastructure included Buddhist monasteries, Hindu temples, and educational institutions that had attracted students from throughout the Indian world for centuries before the Greek conquest. Rather than attempting to replace these facilities with purely Greek institutions, Indo-Greek rulers incorporated them into their administrative and cultural systems, while adding Greek elements that enhanced the city's cosmopolitan character. The Buddhist monasteries at Taxile became centres for intellectual exchange between Greek philosophical traditions and Indian religious thought, as Greek scholars encountered Buddhist concepts of ethics, psychology, and metaphysics that differed significantly from their native philosophical systems. This interaction produced new forms of artistic expression and intellectual synthesis that influenced both Greek and Indian cultural development. Greek sculptors working in Gandhara learned Indian iconographic traditions while applying Greek artistic techniques to create the distinctive Gandhara style that combined Hellenistic realism with Buddhist spiritual themes. The reign of Menander I, known in Indian sources as Milinda, represented the pinnacle of Indo-Greek cultural achievement through his patronage of Buddhist learning and his reputation as a philosopher king who engaged seriously with Indian intellectual traditions. The Milinda Panha, a Buddhist text that records discussions between Menander and the monk Nagasena, provides detailed evidence for the sophisticated theological and philosophical exchanges that occurred between Greek rulers and Indian religious teachers. These discussions addressed fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the problem of suffering, and the possibility of liberation from rebirth that were central to Buddhist thought but also connected to Greek philosophical concerns about ethics and the good life. Menander's conversion to Buddhism, while not requiring him to abandon all Greek cultural practices, demonstrated the profound impact that Indian religious traditions could have on Greek rulers who governed Indian populations. His coins began to feature Buddhist symbols alongside traditional Greek royal iconography, while his administrative policies showed increased concern for the moral and spiritual welfare of his subjects. The king's reputation for justice and wisdom spread throughout the Indian world, creating a model of enlightened rulership that influenced subsequent Indo-Greek monarchs and contributed to the peaceful integration of Greek political authority with Indian social and religious structures. The economic foundations of the Indo-Greek kingdoms rested on their control over the trade routes that connected India with Central Asia, China, and the Mediterranean world. The wealth generated by customs duties on luxury goods, including silk, spices, precious stones, and exotic animals, provided Indo-Greek rulers with resources that could support substantial military forces while funding the cultural patronage that enhanced their legitimacy among educated Indian populations. The kingdom's position as an intermediary between different commercial networks created opportunities for profit that exceeded those available to purely regional powers. The monetary systems developed by Indo-Greek rulers reflected their need to facilitate commerce between different economic zones, while maintaining political control over diverse populations. Royal mints produced coins in various metals and denominations that could serve the needs of both local retail trade and long-distance commercial transactions. The bilingual inscriptions that appeared on many Indo-Greek coins, featuring Greek text on one side and Kharoshthi or Brahmi script on the other, demonstrated the kingdom's commitment to serving both Greek and Indian constituencies, while maintaining their distinctive identity as Hellenistic states. The artistic achievements of the Gandhara school represented one of the most significant cultural developments to emerge from the interaction between Greek and Indian civilizations. Sculptors working under Indo-Greek patronage created Buddhist religious art that combined Greek techniques for representing human anatomy and emotion with Indian iconographic traditions that conveyed specific religious meanings. The resulting sculptures achieved a synthesis of realistic portraiture and spiritual symbolism that influenced artistic development throughout Central Asia and East Asia for centuries after the fall of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. The gradual decline of Greek political power in Central Asia and India resulted from the cumulative pressure of nomadic invasions, internal political fragmentation, and the emergence of new regional powers that could challenge Greek military superiority. The Parthian expansion westward from their original territories in northeastern Iran brought them into direct conflict with Greco-Bactrian forces around 140 BC, as Parthian cavalry proved capable of defeating traditional Greek military formations through their superior mobility and archery skills. The Scythian invasions that followed the Parthian conquest of western Bactria represented an even more serious threat to the remaining Greek territories, as these nomadic peoples brought large populations seeking new pasture lands rather than simply conducting raids for plunder. The Scythians' ability to field numerous cavalry armies simultaneously stretched Greek defensive capabilities beyond their limits, forcing the abandonment of outlying territories and the concentration of remaining forces around a few heavily fortified urban centres. The rise of the Kushan Empire under Kujula Kadphises around 30 AD marked the final phase of Greek political influence in the region, as this new power combined nomadic military traditions with sophisticated administrative techniques learned from their Greek predecessors. The last Indo-Greek rulers maintained precarious independence in small territories around Taxila and other cities until approximately 10 AD, when Kushan expansion eliminated the final remnants of Greek political authority in the Indian subcontinent. The emergence of the Kushan Empire represented only one facet of the mounting pressure that barbarian peoples exerted against Hellenistic civilization during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. While Greek rulers in Bactria and India faced nomadic invasions from the steppes, their Western counterparts confronted an equally formidable challenge from Celtic tribes whose military prowess and territorial ambitions would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor. The Celtic migrations that swept across Europe during the early 3rd century BC brought these fierce warriors into direct contact with Hellenistic kingdoms at precisely the moment when internal conflicts and succession disputes had weakened royal authority and military preparedness. The Celtic expansion into southeastern Europe began as a continuation of population movements that had been building pressure against established territories for generations. The Latinic culture that characterized Celtic society during this period had developed sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produced superior weapons and armour, while their social organisation around warrior bands led by charismatic chieftains created military formations capable of rapid mobilisation and sustained campaigning across vast distances. Unlike the settled agricultural populations that typically comprised Hellenistic armies, Celtic warriors viewed military service as their primary occupation and source of social status, creating a professional military class that could maintain combat effectiveness through extended campaigns far from their homeland. The initial Celtic penetration into the Balkans, around 280 BC, exploited the political fragmentation that had followed the collapse of Lysimachus's kingdom after his death at Corypidium. The Thracian territories that had formed the core of Lysimachus's power lacked unified leadership capable of organising effective resistance against Celtic raiding parties that could appear suddenly at any point along the region's extensive frontiers. Celtic war bands, typically numbering several thousand warriors accompanied by their families and baggage trains, moved through Thracian territory with impunity, extracting tribute from local populations while seeking more substantial targets that could provide the wealth necessary to sustain their mobile lifestyle. The Celtic military system that confronted Hellenistic forces differed fundamentally from the disciplined formations that had characterized warfare between Greek kingdoms. Celtic warriors fought as individuals or in small groups, rather than maintaining the rigid formations that distinguished phalanx infantry or cavalry squadrons. Their primary weapons included long iron swords designed for slashing attacks, spears that could be used for both thrusting and throwing, and large oval shields that provided protection while allowing considerable mobility. Celtic warriors typically wore minimal armour, relying on their speed and ferocity to overwhelm enemies before defensive equipment became crucial for survival. The psychological impact of Celtic warfare proved as significant as their tactical capabilities, as their battle customs included practices designed to terrorise opponents and demonstrate their contempt for death. Celtic warriors often fought naked or nearly naked, their bodies painted with blue woad designs that enhanced their fearsome appearance while proclaiming their spiritual protection. They entered battle screaming war cries and blowing bronze horns that created cacophonous noise intended to panic enemy troops unused to such displays. The Celtic practice of collecting enemy heads as trophies, combined with their reputation for ritual sacrifice of prisoners, created an aura of savagery that could demoralize Hellenistic forces before actual combat began. The most ambitious Celtic expedition targeted the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi in 279 BC, as 3 separate tribal armies converged on central Greece under the leadership of Brennus, whose name may have been a title rather than a personal identifier. The choice of Delphi as a target reflected both the sanctuary's legendary wealth and its symbolic significance as the spiritual centre of the Greek world. The accumulated treasures donated by Greek cities and foreign rulers over centuries had created one of the ancient world's greatest concentrations of precious metals and artistic objects, making it an irresistible target for warriors whose primary motivation was the acquisition of portable wealth. The march toward Delphi required Celtic forces to traverse territories controlled by various Greek cities and leagues, that attempted to organise defensive coalitions against the barbarian invasion. The Aetolian League, whose federal structure provided advantages in coordinating military responses across multiple communities, assumed primary responsibility for defending the sanctuary while requesting assistance from other Greek powers. The Aetolians' familiarity with mountain warfare and their experience fighting as light infantry made them better suited to combat Celtic tactics than the heavy infantry formations that dominated most Hellenistic military systems. The battle at Thermopylae demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Celtic military methods when confronted with prepared defensive positions held by determined opponents. The narrow pass that had witnessed the famous last stand of Leonidas and his Spartans provided natural advantages for defenders who could concentrate their forces against attackers advancing along a restricted front. The Greek coalition assembled approximately 40,000 troops from various cities and leagues, creating a substantial defensive force that included both traditional hoplite infantry and the lighter troops better suited to mountain combat. Celtic attempts to force the pass through direct assault reveal the limitations of their individualistic fighting style when confronted with coordinated defensive formations. The narrow terrain prevented them from utilising their superior numbers effectively while negating the mobility advantages that characterise their typical tactical approach. Greek defenders, fighting from prepared positions with the advantage of higher ground, could employ missile weapons and coordinated spear thrusts that inflicted heavy casualties on Celtic attackers who lacked the protective equipment necessary for sustained assault operations. The Celtic discovery of the mountain path that had allowed Xerxes to outflank Leonidas demonstrated their adaptability and tactical intelligence, as scouts familiar with local terrain identified routes that could bypass the main defensive position. However, the Aetolians had learned from historical precedent and positioned substantial forces to guard these alternative approaches. The fighting in the mountain passes required different tactical skills from the main battle, as both sides struggled with difficult terrain that limited the effectiveness of traditional formations while favouring individual combat skills and local knowledge of the landscape. The ultimate failure of the Celtic assault on Delphi resulted from a combination of determined Greek resistance, unfavourable weather conditions, and the internal divisions that plagued Celtic leadership during extended campaigns. Ancient sources described supernatural interventions, including earthquakes and phantom warriors that allegedly aided the Greek defenders, but these accounts likely reflect natural phenomena and psychological factors that affected both armies during the prolonged siege. The onset of winter weather created logistical problems for Celtic forces that lacked adequate supplies for sustained operations in mountainous terrain, while Greek defenders could rely on local resources and establish supply lines. The retreat of Brennus's forces marked a turning point in Celtic fortunes, as the failure to capture Delphi's treasures left many warriors without the wealth necessary to maintain their loyalty to the expedition's leadership. Celtic armies began fragmenting into smaller groups that pursued independent objectives throughout the Greek world, creating a dispersed threat that was easier for individual kingdoms to address but more difficult to eliminate completely. Some Celtic bands established temporary bases in Thrace and Macedonia, extracting tribute from local populations while seeking opportunities for more profitable ventures. The most significant long-term consequence of the Celtic invasion was the migration of approximately 20,000 warriors and their families into Asia Minor, where they would establish the Kingdom of Galatia that would endure for centuries as a distinctive Celtic enclave within the Hellenistic world. This migration occurred under the leadership of Leonorios and Lutarios, who had emerged as dominant figures among the Celtic tribes after Brennus's death during the retreat from Delphi. The decision to cross into Asia Minor reflected both the immediate need to escape Greek retaliation and the recognition that Anatolia offered better opportunities for establishing permanent settlements than the increasingly hostile Greek mainland. The invitation extended by Nicomedes IV of Bithynia to Celtic mercenaries represented a calculated political decision that would have far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in Asia Minor. Nicomedes faced military pressure from his brother Xiphoetes and needed additional forces to secure his throne, while the Celts required a patron who could provide them with legitimate employment and territorial base for their families. The alliance that emerged from these mutual needs gave Celtic warriors access to Asian wealth, while providing Bithynia with military capabilities that exceeded those of neighbouring kingdoms. The initial Celtic campaigns in Asia Minor demonstrated their continued military effectiveness against Hellenistic opponents who had not yet developed appropriate countermeasures for their unconventional tactics. Celtic raids devastated the territories of Pergamon, whose ruler Eumenes found his traditional military forces inadequate for protecting rural populations against highly mobile enemies who could strike suddenly and withdraw before organised retaliation became possible. The psychological impact of Celtic warfare proved particularly effective against Asian populations who lacked previous experience with barbarian military customs and were unprepared for the brutality that characterised Celtic treatment of prisoners and civilians. The establishment of Galatian settlements in Central and Anatolia required negotiations with various local powers who recognised that Celtic military strength made them valuable allies despite their barbarian origins. The three main tribal groups, the Trochmi, Tolistobugii, and Tectosages, each received distinct territories that provided agricultural land for their families while maintaining the tribal organisation that had characterised their European homeland. These territorial arrangements created a unique political structure that combined Celtic tribal customs with the administrative necessities of governing settled populations in an Anatolian environment. The adaptation of Celtic society to Anatolian conditions involved significant modifications of traditional customs while preserving essential elements of tribal identity and military organisation. Celtic warriors continued to practice their traditional fighting methods and maintain their distinctive weapons and armour, but they also learned to construct permanent fortifications and develop agricultural techniques suited to Anatolian climate and soil conditions. The integration of captured populations into Celtic society created mixed communities where Celtic military traditions coexisted with local agricultural and craft knowledge. The military challenges posed by Celtic settlement forced neighbouring Hellenistic kingdoms to develop new tactical approaches and strategic concepts that could address the unique problems created by barbarian warfare. The traditional reliance on heavy infantry formations proved inadequate against enemies who avoided direct confrontation while conducting raids that could devastate rural areas and disrupt economic activities essential for maintaining royal revenues. Hellenistic commanders began experimenting with lighter infantry formations, increased cavalry forces, and fortification systems designed to protect agricultural populations against mobile raiders. Attalus I of Pergamon emerged as the most successful Hellenistic ruler in developing effective countermeasures against Celtic military tactics through his systematic approach to analysing barbarian warfare and adapting his forces accordingly. His military reforms included the recruitment of Mysian and other local troops familiar with mountain warfare, the development of fortified settlements that could serve as refuges for rural populations during Celtic raids, and the creation of rapid response forces capable of pursuing Celtic warbands before they could escape with their plunder. The decisive victories achieved by Attalus I against the Galatians around 230 BC represented a turning point in Hellenistic barbarian relations that demonstrated the possibility of military success against Celtic forces through appropriate tactical modifications and strategic planning. The battle fought near the sources of the Caicus River showcased Pergamene innovations in combining traditional phalanx formations with light infantry and cavalry forces that could match Celtic mobility while maintaining superior discipline and coordination. the defeat of Celtic forces in this engagement eliminated their ability to conduct large-scale raids while forcing them to accept more restricted territorial arrangements. The subsequent integration of Galatian communities into the broader Anatolian political system occurred through a gradual process of cultural adaptation that preserved Celtic military traditions while adopting Hellenistic administrative and urban practices. Galatian settlements developed market centres that facilitated trade with neighbouring Greek cities, while Celtic warriors increasingly served as mercenaries in Hellenistic armies rather than conducting independent raids. This transformation reflected both the military pressure applied by powers like Pergamon and the economic opportunities available through peaceful integration with established commercial networks. The northern frontiers of the Hellenistic world faced additional pressures from Germanic tribes whose migrations paralleled Celtic movements but followed different patterns of territorial expansion and cultural development. Germanic peoples, distinguished from Celts by their linguistic and cultural traditions, began pressing southward from their original territories in Scandinavia and northern Germany during the 3rd century BC, creating conflicts with Celtic populations and indirect pressure on Hellenistic territories through the displacement of intervening peoples. The Cimbri and Teutonus, Germanic tribes whose migrations would later bring them into direct conflict with Roman forces, initially affected Hellenistic territories through their displacement of Celtic and Thracian populations that had served as buffer zones between the Greek world and northern barbarians. The southward movement of these Germanic peoples created a domino effect that pushed other tribal groups toward territories controlled by Hellenistic kingdoms, increasing the frequency of barbarian raids and the pressure on frontier defense systems. The Thracian tribes that inhabited the mountainous regions north of Macedonia and the Greek cities of the Black Sea coast represented a persistent challenge to Hellenistic authority that required constant military attention and diplomatic management. Unlike the Celts, who typically operated as unified armies under charismatic leaders, Thracian resistance took the form of numerous small-scale raids and rebellions that were difficult to suppress completely but rarely posed existential threats to major kingdoms. The fragmented nature of Thracian political organisation made it impossible to achieve lasting peace through negotiations with individual leaders, as agreements with one tribe had no binding effect on neighbouring groups. The military characteristics of Thracian warfare emphasised individual prowess and mobility, rather than the coordinated formations that distinguished both Celtic warbands and Hellenistic armies. Thracian warriors typically fought as light infantry armed with javelins, curved swords called rhomphaia, and small shields that provided protection without limiting mobility. Their familiarity with mountainous terrain gave them significant advantages when fighting in their native territories, while their practice of conducting rapid raids followed by withdrawal to inaccessible strongholds made them difficult targets for conventional military operations. The Scythian peoples who controlled the steppes north of the Black Sea represented a different type of barbarian threat that combined the mobility of nomadic cavalry with sophisticated political organisation and extensive commercial networks. Unlike the migrating Celtic and Germanic tribes that sought new territories for permanent settlement, the Scythians operated from established bases in the Ukrainian steppes while conducting raids and diplomatic relations that could extend their influence across vast distances without requiring territorial conquest. Scythian military capabilities centred on their unparalleled skill as mounted archers, whose composite bows could deliver accurate fire at ranges that exceeded those of most Hellenistic missile weapons. Scythian cavalry tactics emphasised mobility and harassment rather than decisive engagement, as their horsemen could appear suddenly at any point along extended frontiers, inflict casualties through archery, and withdraw before enemy forces could organise effective responses. This tactical approach proved particularly effective against infantry-heavy Hellenistic armies that lacked sufficient cavalry forces to match Scythian mobility. The Greek cities of the Pontic coast, including Chersonesos, Tanais and Olbia, maintained precarious independence through their ability to balance diplomatic relations with various Scythian rulers, while providing commercial services that made them valuable to nomadic peoples who lacked urban manufacturing capabilities. These cities served as intermediaries between the Scythian world and the broader Hellenistic economy, exchanging Greek manufactured goods and luxury items for grain, livestock, slaves, and raw materials produced in the steppes. The fortification systems developed by these frontier cities reflected the unique challenges of defending against nomadic attacks while maintaining the commercial relationships essential for economic survival. City walls were designed to withstand siege techniques employed by nomadic peoples, who typically lacked the heavy equipment and engineering knowledge necessary for systematic assault operations, but could conduct extended blockades that threatened urban food supplies. The defensive arrangements included provisions for protecting harbour facilities and maintaining sea communications that could provide relief during land-based sieges. The cultural impact of prolonged contact between Hellenistic civilization and various barbarian peoples extended far beyond military and political relationships to encompass artistic traditions, religious practices, and social customs that created hybrid forms of expression throughout the frontier regions. Hellenistic artists working in areas with significant barbarian populations began incorporating Celtic and Thracian decorative motifs into traditional Greek artistic forms, while barbarian craftsmen adopted Greek techniques and materials that enhanced the quality and market value of their products. The religious syncretism that emerged in frontier regions reflected the practical necessities of governing mixed populations, while maintaining the loyalty of both Greek colonists and indigenous communities. Celtic deities acquired Greek names and attributes that made them acceptable to Hellenistic religious sensibilities, while Greek gods received Celtic characteristics that enhanced their appeal to barbarian populations. The resulting religious forms combined Greek mythological narratives with Celtic ritual practices, creating new forms of worship that could satisfy diverse spiritual needs within the same political communities. The recruitment of barbarian mercenaries became an increasingly important aspect of Hellenistic military organization, as kingdoms sought to augment their traditional forces with troops who possessed specialized skills and could provide numerical strength at lower cost than citizen soldiers. Celtic warriors, renowned for their individual fighting prowess and fearless attitude toward death, served in Hellenistic armies throughout the eastern Mediterranean while maintaining their distinctive weapons, armor, and tactical methods. This military integration created opportunities for cultural exchange, while providing barbarian peoples with access to Greek military technology and organizational techniques. The barbarization of frontier regions represented only one facet of the mounting challenges that would ultimately transform the Hellenistic world beyond recognition. While Greek kingdoms struggled to maintain their eastern territories against nomadic invasions and their northern frontiers against Celtic and Germanic pressure, a new power was emerging in the western Mediterranean that would prove far more dangerous to Greek independence than any barbarian threat. The Roman Republic, having consolidated its control over the Italian peninsula through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic alliance, began extending its influence eastward during the late 3rd century BC, with a systematic approach to power projection that differed fundamentally from the opportunistic raiding that characterized barbarian warfare. The First Macedonian War erupted in 214 BC as a direct consequence of Philip V's decision to align his kingdom with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, a strategic calculation that would prove catastrophic for Macedonian independence. Philip's treaty with Carthage, negotiated while Roman forces struggled against Hannibal's invasion of Italy, represented a logical attempt to exploit Roman weakness while gaining Carthaginian support for Macedonian expansion in the Adriatic region. The agreement promised mutual assistance against Rome and territorial arrangements that would have given Macedonia control over southern Italy once Hannibal achieved victory, creating a powerful anti-Roman alliance that could dominate the entire Mediterranean basin. Philip's immediate military objectives focused on the Adriatic coast, where Roman client cities like Apollonia and Epidamnus provided strategic bases that could threaten Macedonian communications with potential Italian territories. The Macedonian fleet, rebuilt during the peaceful decades following the Celtic invasions, possessed sufficient strength to challenge Roman naval supremacy in the confined waters of the Adriatic Sea, while supporting amphibious operations against coastal targets. Philip's initial campaigns achieved considerable success, capturing several Illyrian strongholds and establishing Macedonian garrisons that could serve as bases for future operations against Roman positions. The Roman response to Macedonian aggression demonstrated the Republic's growing sophistication in managing multiple simultaneous conflicts across vast geographical distances. Despite the enormous military commitments required for the war against Hannibal in Italy and Spain, Roman commanders allocated sufficient resources to the Eastern Theatre to prevent Philip from achieving decisive advantages that could alter the strategic balance. The Roman fleet operating from bases in southern Italy and Sicily maintained control over crucial sea lanes while providing support for allied cities that remained loyal to Roman interests. The Aetolian League's decision to ally with Rome against Macedonia reflected the complex political calculations that characterized Greek responses to the emerging Roman threat. The Aetolians, traditional enemies of Macedonian expansion, recognized that Philip's success in the Adriatic would inevitably lead to renewed pressure on central Greek territories that had maintained precarious independence through federal organization and military cooperation. The Roman alliance offered protection against Macedonian retaliation, while providing access to Roman financial and military resources that could enhance Aetolian capabilities against traditional rivals. The military campaigns that followed demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Roman intervention in Greek affairs during this early period. Roman forces operating in Greece consisted primarily of allied contingents rather than citizen legions, reflecting the Republic's reluctance to commit substantial resources to eastern operations, while the Carthaginian threat remained unresolved. These allied troops, while numerous and adequately equipped, lack the training and cohesion that characterized veteran Roman legions, creating opportunities for Macedonian forces to achieve tactical victories despite their strategic disadvantages. Philip's siege of Aquinas in 211 BC showcased the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Macedonian forces had developed during 2 centuries of Hellenistic warfare. The city's fortifications, typical of Greek defensive architecture, featured high walls constructed from fitted stone blocks, projecting towers that provided overlapping fields of fire, and complex gate systems designed to channel attackers into killing zones where defenders could concentrate their missile weapons. Philip's engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included battering rams, siege towers, and catapults capable of breaching these formidable defences through systematic application of mechanical force. The Macedonian army that operated during this period retained the essential characteristics of Hellenistic military organisation, while incorporating tactical innovations developed through decades of frontier warfare against barbarian opponents. The phalanx formations remained the core of Philip's infantry strength, with experienced soldiers wielding 18-foot sarissas in dense formations that could dominate battlefields through coordinated advance and defensive capability. However, these traditional units now operated alongside lighter infantry forces recruited from Thracian and Illyrian populations, who brought specialised skills in mountain warfare and irregular tactics that proved valuable against Roman allied forces. The inconclusive nature of the First Macedonian War's conclusion in 205 BC reflected the mutual exhaustion that characterised both sides after years of campaigning across difficult terrain with limited strategic objectives. The Peace of Phenice restored the territorial status quo, while establishing diplomatic relationships that would influence subsequent conflicts between Rome and the Hellenistic kingdoms. Philip retained his Illyrian conquests, but abandoned his alliance with Carthage, effectively acknowledging Roman supremacy in the Western Mediterranean while preserving Macedonian independence in traditional Balkan territories. The brief interwar period that followed provided Philip with opportunities to consolidate his kingdom's military and economic resources, while observing the dramatic expansion of Roman power that accompanied Hannibal's defeat and the subsequent Roman conquest of Carthaginian territories in Spain and North Africa. The transformation of Rome from a regional Italian power into the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean occurred with remarkable speed, creating a strategic situation that threatened all existing Hellenistic kingdoms with eventual absorption into an expanding Roman Empire. Philip's alliance with Antiochus III of Syria represented a logical response to the growing Roman threat, as the two most powerful Hellenistic rulers recognized that their individual kingdoms lacked sufficient resources to resist Roman expansion if it continued at its current pace. The secret agreement negotiated between the two monarchs in 203 BC envisioned a coordinated campaign against Roman positions in the eastern Mediterranean, with Macedonian forces operating in Greece and the Aegean, while Seleucid armies advanced through Asia Minor toward Roman client cities along the Anatolian coast. The diplomatic revolution that preceded the Second Macedonian War demonstrated Rome's growing sophistication in manipulating Greek political divisions to achieve strategic objectives without committing overwhelming military resources. Roman ambassadors systematically cultivated relationships with Greek cities and leagues that had grievances against Macedonian expansion, offering protection and autonomy in exchange for military cooperation against Philip. This approach proved particularly effective in Asia Minor, where cities like Pergamon and Rhodes possessed sufficient military capabilities to contribute meaningfully to anti-Macedonian coalitions, while their commercial interests aligned with Roman preferences for political fragmentation rather than unified Hellenistic control. The Roman declaration of war against Macedonia in 200 BC marked a fundamental shift in Republican foreign policy, from defensive responses to external threats toward proactive intervention designed to prevent potential enemies from achieving positions of strength. The Senate's decision to authorize military operations in Greece, despite the absence of direct Macedonian attacks on Roman territories or allies, reflected strategic thinking that prioritized long-term security over immediate defensive necessities. This new approach to international relations would characterize Roman expansion throughout the eastern Mediterranean during the following decades. The Roman forces that landed in Illyria under the command of Publius Sulpicius Galba represented a qualitatively different military threat than the Allied contingents that had operated during the First Macedonian War. The legions deployed for eastern operations included veteran troops with extensive combat experience gained during the Carthaginian conflicts, supported by auxiliary forces that provided specialized capabilities in engineering, cavalry operations, and siege warfare. These professional soldiers possessed training and equipment that exceeded the standards of most Hellenistic armies, while their tactical flexibility allowed adaptation to the varied combat conditions encountered in Greek terrain. The Roman military system that confronted Macedonian forces had evolved considerably during the wars against Carthage, incorporating tactical innovations that addressed the limitations revealed by encounters with Hannibal's multinational army. The manipular organization that characterized Republican legions provided greater flexibility than traditional phalanx formations, while maintaining the disciplinary advantages that distinguished Roman troops from barbarian war bands. Individual maniples could operate independently when terrain prevented coordinated action, while retaining the ability to combine into larger formations when circumstances permitted concentrated attacks. Roman siege warfare capabilities had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication through the technological demands of capturing Carthaginian strongholds in Spain and North Africa. Roman engineers could construct elaborate siege works that included multiple lines of fortification, sophisticated artillery positions, and supply systems capable of sustaining extended operations against heavily defended targets. The systematic approach to siege operations that Romans had developed emphasized methodical preparation and overwhelming force rather than the dramatic assaults that characterized much Hellenistic siege warfare. Philip's defensive strategy during the early phases of the Second Macedonian War reflected his accurate assessment of Roman military capabilities and his recognition that direct confrontation with veteran legions in open terrain would likely result in Macedonian defeat. The king concentrated his forces in mountain strongholds that negated Roman advantages in formation fighting, while utilising his superior knowledge of local terrain to conduct raids and ambushes that inflicted casualties without risking decisive engagement. This approach required careful coordination between regular Macedonian troops and irregular forces recruited from tribal populations who possessed specialised skills in mountain warfare. The Battle of Autolobus in 199 BC demonstrated the effectiveness of Macedonian defensive tactics when properly executed, as Philip's forces inflicted significant casualties on Roman troops attempting to force passage through a narrow mountain valley. The confined terrain prevented the Romans from deploying their superior numbers effectively, while allowing Macedonian troops to utilise prepared positions that maximised their defensive advantages. Philip's personal leadership during the engagement, fighting alongside his soldiers in the front ranks according to Macedonian royal tradition, provided inspirational example that maintained unit cohesion under intense pressure. However, the strategic limitations of defensive warfare became apparent as Roman forces systematically occupied Macedonian territories, while Philip's army remained concentrated in mountain positions that could not protect the agricultural regions essential for supporting his kingdom's population and military forces. Roman commanders demonstrated remarkable patience in conducting methodical campaigns that avoided unnecessary risks while gradually reducing the territorial base available for Macedonian operations. This approach reflected sophisticated understanding of the economic foundations underlying Hellenistic military power. The arrival of Titus Quinctius Flamininus as Roman commander in 198 BC brought new strategic vision to the Eastern campaign that combined military pressure with diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate Macedonia from potential Greek allies. Flamininus possessed exceptional linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge that enabled him to communicate directly with Greek political leaders while understanding the complex relationships between different cities and leagues that characterized Hellenistic politics. His proclamation of Greek freedom, while serving Roman strategic interests, appealed to genuine Greek desires for autonomy that had been suppressed under Macedonian hegemony. The defection of the Achaean League from Macedonian to Roman alliance represented a crucial turning point that demonstrated the effectiveness of Roman diplomatic strategies in exploiting Greek political divisions. The Achaeans, traditional opponents of Aetolian expansion, had previously supported Macedonia as a counterweight to their federal rivals, but Roman promises of protection and autonomy offered superior advantages without the subordination that characterized Macedonian alliance relationships. The League's military forces, while modest compared to royal armies, provided valuable local knowledge and logistical support that enhanced Roman operational capabilities. The siege of Atrax revealed both the strengths and limitations of Macedonian defensive preparations, as Philip's engineers had constructed elaborate fortifications that incorporated the latest developments in military architecture, while the garrison included veteran troops capable of sustained resistance against Roman assault techniques. The city's walls featured projecting towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, complex gate systems that channeled attackers into killing zones, and internal defensive lines that could maintain resistance even after outer fortifications were breached. These sophisticated defences reflected the accumulated military experience of Hellenistic warfare while adapting to the specific challenges posed by Roman siege capabilities. Roman assault techniques employed against attacks demonstrated the systematic approach to siege warfare that had been perfected during campaigns against Carthaginian strongholds in Spain and North Africa. Roman engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included multiple artillery positions, protected approaches for assault troops, and supply systems capable of sustaining extended operations. The coordination between different types of siege equipment, battering rams, siege towers, catapults, and ballistae created overwhelming pressure that even the most sophisticated defensive preparations could not withstand indefinitely. The breakthrough achieved by Roman forces at Cynocephalae in 197 BC resulted from tactical flexibility that allowed adaptation to unexpected combat conditions, rather than adherence to predetermined battle plans. The engagement began as a meeting encounter between advanced forces from both armies operating in hill country that prevented either side from deploying according to their preferred tactical arrangements. The broken terrain that characterized the battlefield negated many of the advantages that both Roman and Macedonian military systems derived from coordinated formation fighting, while emphasizing individual unit capabilities and command decisions made under pressure. The Macedonian phalanx formations that initially dominated the left portion of the battlefield demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional Hellenistic tactics when properly deployed against appropriate opponents. The 18-foot sarissas wielded by experienced phalangites created an impenetrable barrier that Roman infantry could not breach through frontal assault, while the psychological impact of the advancing phalanx caused several Roman units to retreat in disorder. Philip's personal presence in the front ranks provided inspirational leadership that maintained unit cohesion, while his tactical commands adapted phalanx movements to the irregular terrain. However, the tactical inflexibility that characterized phalanx operations became a fatal weakness when Roman forces achieved breakthrough on other portions of the battlefield and attacked the Macedonian formation from flank and rear positions. The dense formation and long weapons that provided phalanx units with their offensive power prevented rapid redeployment to meet attacks from unexpected directions, while the individual phalangites lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective fighting outside their traditional tactical role. The collapse of the Macedonian left wing occurred with dramatic suddenness, as disciplined formations disintegrated under attacks that they could not counter effectively. The Roman victory at Cynocephalae eliminated Macedonian military power as a significant factor in Eastern Mediterranean politics, while establishing Roman supremacy over Greek affairs through demonstration of overwhelming tactical superiority. Philip's losses included not only the immediate casualties suffered during the battle, but also the destruction of military units that had required years to train and equip properly. The king's ability to maintain independence for his remaining territories depended entirely on Roman tolerance, rather than Macedonian military capabilities. The peace terms imposed on Macedonia reflected Roman strategic objectives that prioritized the elimination of threats to Roman interests, while avoiding the administrative burdens that would accompany direct territorial occupation. Philip retained his kingdom, but lost all territories outside Macedonia proper, while his fleet was reduced to 6 vessels and his army limited to 5,000 troops. The massive indemnity of 1,000 talents provided compensation for Roman military expenses while ensuring that Macedonian resources would be devoted to tribute payments rather than military reconstruction for the foreseeable future. The Roman-Syrian war that followed represented the logical extension of Roman intervention in Eastern affairs, as Antiochus III's expansion into Asia Minor and Greece threatened to recreate the conditions that had made Macedonia dangerous to Roman interests. The Seleucid king's occupation of Thrace and his alliance with the Aetolians, who had become disillusioned with Roman promises of autonomy, created a coalition that possessed sufficient military resources to challenge Roman supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean if allowed to consolidate its position. Antiochus III's military capabilities represented the accumulated strength of the Seleucid Empire at its territorial zenith. As the king commanded armies that included traditional Macedonian phalanx units, Persian and Median cavalry, war elephants from India, and specialized troops recruited from throughout his vast territories. The Seleucid military system had evolved through centuries of frontier warfare against Parthians, Bactrians, and various Central Asian peoples, creating tactical flexibility and combat experience that exceeded those of most contemporary armies. The king's personal military reputation, enhanced by his successful eastern campaigns that had restored Seleucid authority as far as the Indus River, provided inspirational leadership that could maintain unit cohesion under adverse conditions. The Roman decision to carry the war into Asia represented a dramatic escalation of Republican military commitments that reflected confidence in their tactical superiority and strategic position following the Macedonian victory. The expeditionary force assembled under Lucius Cornelius Scipio included veteran legions that had participated in the Spanish and African campaigns against Carthage, supported by allied contingents from Greek cities and kingdoms that had aligned themselves with Roman interests. The logistical challenges of maintaining large armies across the Aegean Sea required unprecedented coordination between Roman naval and land forces while establishing supply bases that could support extended operations in unfamiliar territory. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC showcased the tactical superiority that Roman military organisation had achieved over traditional Hellenistic warfare through decades of innovation and combat experience. The Seleucid army deployed according to conventional patterns that positioned phalanx infantry in the centre, with cavalry and specialised troops on the flanks, creating a formation that had proven effective against various enemies throughout the Hellenistic period. Antiochus personally commanded the right-wing cavalry in the heroic tradition of Hellenistic kingship, leading charges that initially achieved considerable success against Roman allied forces. However, the Roman tactical system demonstrated superior adaptability when the battle's development created opportunities for exploitation that traditional Hellenistic formations could not address effectively. The Roman centre, composed of veteran legions with extensive combat experience, maintained formation integrity while absorbing Seleucid attacks that would have broken less disciplined troops. When gaps appeared in the Seleucid line due to the uneven success of different units, Roman commanders possessed the tactical flexibility and communication systems necessary to redirect their forces toward these vulnerable points. The collapse of Seleucid resistance occurred with the same dramatic suddenness that had characterized the Macedonian defeat at Cynocephali, as the systematic Roman exploitation of tactical opportunities created cascading failures throughout Antiochus's army. The war elephants that had initially created panic among Roman horses became liabilities when wounded animals turned against their own troops, while the diverse ethnic composition of Seleucid forces created communication problems that prevented coordinated responses to changing battlefield conditions. The king's personal escape from the disaster preserved his life, but eliminated his credibility as a military leader capable of challenging Roman expansion. The Treaty of Apamea, imposed on Antiochus III in 188 BC, represented the most comprehensive territorial rearrangement in Hellenistic history, as Roman terms eliminated Seleucid power west of the Taurus Mountains, while redistributing Asian territories among Roman allies and client states. The Seleucid Empire lost all of Asia Minor except Cilicia, territories that had provided crucial revenues and military recruitment grounds for over a century. The massive indemnity of 15,000 talents, payable over 12 years, ensured that Seleucid resources would be devoted to tribute payments rather than military reconstruction, effectively ending the empire's ability to challenge Roman supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. The territorial redistributions that accompanied the Treaty of Apamea fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, creating conditions that would accelerate the final transformation of independent Hellenistic kingdoms into Roman provinces. While Pergamon and Rhodes gained substantial territories as rewards for their loyalty, these acquisitions came with the implicit understanding that their continued prosperity depended entirely on Roman goodwill, rather than their own military capabilities. The systematic reduction of Seleucid power had eliminated the last kingdom capable of challenging Roman supremacy through direct military confrontation, leaving the remaining Hellenistic rulers in positions where survival required careful navigation of Roman political preferences rather than pursuit of traditional royal ambitions. The Third Macedonian War erupted in 171 BC, when Perseus, Philip the son and successor, attempted to restore Macedonian independence through a carefully orchestrated diplomatic campaign designed to unite Greek opposition to Roman hegemony. Perseus possessed significant advantages that his father had lacked during the earlier conflicts, including a fully restored treasury, modernized military forces, and diplomatic relationships with potential allies throughout the Greek world, who had grown disillusioned with Roman promises of autonomy. The young king's marriage alliances with the Seleucid and Bithynian royal families created the foundation for a potential anti-Roman coalition that could field substantial military resources across multiple theatres simultaneously. Perseus's diplomatic initiatives demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the grievances that Roman policy had created among various Greek communities during the decades following Cynocephaly. Many cities that had initially welcomed Roman liberation from Macedonian control discovered that Roman concepts of Greek freedom differed significantly from traditional Greek notions of political autonomy. Roman interference in internal Greek affairs, demands for tribute and military support, and the systematic elimination of leaders who showed excessive independence had created widespread resentment that Perseus could exploit through promises of restored genuine autonomy under Macedonian protection. The Roman response to Perseus's diplomatic activities revealed the extent to which the Republic had developed systematic approaches to intelligence gathering and political manipulation throughout the Greek world. Roman agents operating in major Greek cities provided detailed reports regarding local political developments, identifying potential threats to Roman interests before they could achieve dangerous momentum. The Senate's decision to authorize preemptive military action against Macedonia reflected strategic thinking that prioritized the elimination of potential challenges rather than waiting for actual hostile actions that might prove more difficult to counter. The Roman army that assembled for the Third Macedonian War represented the culmination of military developments that had been refined through decades of Mediterranean conquests. The legions deployed under Lucius Aemilius Paulus included veteran troops with extensive combat experience gained during campaigns in Spain, Gaul, and previous Eastern operations, supported by auxiliary forces that provided specialized capabilities adapted to Greek terrain and tactical conditions. The Roman military machine had evolved into a professional organization capable of sustained operations across vast distances while maintaining logistical efficiency and tactical effectiveness that exceeded those of any contemporary enemy. Macedonian military preparations under Perseus demonstrated the kingdom's remarkable recovery from the disasters that had befallen Philip V's forces at Cynocephaly. The royal army included traditional phalanx units equipped with improved armour and weapons, Thracian light infantry trained in irregular warfare techniques, and cavalry forces that incorporated tactical innovations developed through observation of Roman methods. Perseus had invested substantial resources in fortification projects that protected key strategic positions while providing secure bases for military operations against Roman invasion forces. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BC marked the final confrontation between traditional Hellenistic military systems and Roman tactical innovations that had been perfected through 2 centuries of continuous warfare. The engagement began when advance units from both armies encountered each other along the Elpais River, creating a meeting battle that prevented either side from deploying according to their preferred tactical arrangements. The broken terrain that characterized the initial fighting favored neither Roman nor Macedonian formations, leading to extended skirmishing that tested the training and morale of individual units rather than the effectiveness of coordinated tactical systems. Perseus personally commanded the Macedonian right wing in accordance with royal military traditions that required kings to share the dangers faced by their soldiers while providing inspirational leadership during critical moments. The king wore gilded armour that identified his position to both friendly and enemy forces, carrying weapons that combined practical effectiveness with symbolic significance as representations of royal authority. His presence in the front ranks maintained unit cohesion among Macedonian troops who fought with desperate determination, recognizing that defeat would likely result in the permanent elimination of their kingdom's independence. The Macedonian phalanx initially achieved considerable success against Roman legions that attempted frontal assaults against the 18-foot sarissas that created an impenetrable barrier of bronze and iron points. The psychological impact of the advancing phalanx, with its forest of spear points glittering in the afternoon sun and the rhythmic tramping of thousands of hobnailed sandals, created moments of panic among Roman troops who had never previously encountered such formations in actual combat. Several Roman units retreated in disorder as the Macedonian advance gained momentum, threatening to create gaps in the Roman line that could be exploited by Perseus's cavalry forces. However, the tactical limitations that had plagued phalanx warfare since Alexander's time became decisive factors as the battle developed across increasingly broken terrain that prevented coordinated movement by dense formations. Roman centurions, trained to exploit tactical opportunities through individual initiative rather than adherence to rigid battle plans, recognized that the phalanx units became vulnerable when forced to negotiate obstacles that disrupted their formation integrity. Small groups of Roman soldiers infiltrated gaps that appeared in the Macedonian line, attacking individual phalangites from close range, where their long spears became useless encumbrances rather than effective weapons. The collapse of the Macedonian centre occurred with catastrophic suddenness as coordinated Roman attacks from multiple directions created panic that spread throughout Perseus's army faster than officers could restore order. The king's escape from the battlefield preserved his life, but eliminated any possibility of continued resistance, as the destruction of the royal army left Macedonia defenceless against Roman occupation forces that could now operate throughout the kingdom without encountering organised opposition. The battle's aftermath included the systematic looting of the Macedonian royal treasury, which provided Roman commanders with wealth sufficient to fund future military operations, while demonstrating the material benefits of successful conquest. The Roman settlement imposed on Macedonia following Pydna represented a fundamental departure from previous peace arrangements that had preserved nominal independence while imposing restrictions on military and diplomatic activities. Rather than maintaining Perseus as a client king under Roman supervision, the victorious Romans abolished the Macedonian monarchy entirely and divided the kingdom into 4 separate republics that were forbidden from maintaining diplomatic or commercial relationships with each other. This fragmentation eliminated Macedonia's ability to function as a unified political entity, while creating administrative arrangements that served Roman strategic interests. The systematic deportation of prominent Macedonians to Italy reflected Roman recognition that effective control over conquered territories required the elimination of local leadership that might organize future resistance movements. Perseus himself was transported to Rome, where he participated in Paulus's triumph, before spending his remaining years in comfortable captivity that preserved his life while eliminating his political significance. The removal of the entire Macedonian royal family, along with hundreds of nobles and military officers, created a leadership vacuum that prevented the emergence of organised opposition to Roman rule. The transformation of Macedonia from an independent kingdom into Roman administrative districts marked a crucial precedent for the treatment of other Hellenistic territories that would subsequently fall under Roman control. The four Macedonian republics operated under constitutions that incorporated Roman legal principles while maintaining Greek institutional forms that provided familiar governmental structures for local populations. This administrative approach demonstrated Roman sophistication in managing conquered territories through systems that balanced imperial control with local autonomy in matters that did not affect broader strategic interests. The Third Punic War and the simultaneous Fourth Macedonian War revealed the extent to which Roman strategic thinking had evolved towards systematic elimination of potential threats rather than management of existing rivalries. The Roman decision to destroy Carthage completely, despite the absence of any realistic Carthaginian threat to Roman security, reflected a strategic doctrine that prioritized absolute security over diplomatic accommodation. The concurrent suppression of Andriscus's attempt to restore Macedonian independence demonstrated Roman willingness to employ overwhelming force against even minor challenges to their established order. The Achaean War that concluded the period of Greek independence represented the final attempt by traditional Greek institutions to resist Roman hegemony through coordinated military action. The Achaean League, which had maintained federal autonomy longer than most Greek political organizations, found itself increasingly constrained by Roman interference in internal affairs that violated the principles of self-governance that had justified initial cooperation with Roman forces against Macedonia. The League's decision to resist Roman demands regarding the treatment of Sparta reflected genuine commitment to Greek political traditions rather than mere opportunistic rebellion. The Roman siege of Corinth in 146 BC demonstrated the overwhelming military capabilities that 2 centuries of continuous warfare had created, as Roman engineers deployed siege equipment and tactical techniques that rendered traditional Greek fortifications obsolete. The city's walls, constructed according to classical Greek defensive principles, proved incapable of withstanding systematic assault by Roman forces that possessed superior artillery, more effective siege techniques, and larger numbers of experienced troops than any previous besieging army. The systematic destruction that followed Corinth's capture served both practical and symbolic purposes, eliminating a potential centre of future Greek resistance, while demonstrating the consequences of opposing Roman authority. The sack of Corinth included the systematic removal of artistic treasures that had accumulated over centuries of Greek cultural achievement, as Roman commanders recognized the material and symbolic value of Greek art for display in Rome's public spaces and private collections. Masterpieces of sculpture, painting, and metalwork that had adorned Corinthian temples and public buildings were transported to Italy, where they would influence Roman artistic development while serving as permanent reminders of Greek cultural achievements and Roman military success. This cultural appropriation represented a more sophisticated approach to conquest than simple destruction, as Romans demonstrated appreciation for Greek artistic excellence while asserting their political dominance. The final conquest of Ptolemaic Egypt occurred under dramatically different circumstances than the earlier Roman victories over Macedonia and the Achaean League, as the last major Hellenistic kingdom fell not through military defeat, but through the political machinations surrounding the Roman civil wars that destroyed the Republic itself. Cleopatra VII's alliance with Mark Antony represented a calculated attempt to preserve Egyptian independence through partnership with a Roman leader who possessed sufficient military resources to challenge Octavian's growing power, while maintaining respect for Ptolemaic royal traditions and Egyptian cultural autonomy. Cleopatra's political acumen exceeded that of most contemporary rulers, as she successfully maintained Egyptian independence for nearly 2 decades. Through careful navigation of Roman factional conflicts, while preserving the essential institutions of Ptolemaic government. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and subsequently Mark Antony reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman political dynamics rather than mere personal attraction, as these alliances provided Egypt with protection against Roman conquest, while offering her Roman partners access to Egyptian wealth and administrative expertise that could enhance their positions in Roman civil conflicts. The naval battle of Actium in 31 BC represented the final confrontation between Hellenistic royal traditions and Roman republican institutions, as Cleopatra and Antony's combined forces faced Octavian's fleet in waters that had witnessed naval combat since the Persian Wars 3 centuries earlier. The Egyptian ships that participated in the battle included vessels constructed according to Hellenistic naval architecture that emphasized size and firepower over the maneuverability that characterized Roman galley design. These massive warships, some reportedly mounting multiple artillery pieces and carrying hundreds of marines, represented the culmination of Ptolemaic naval development that had dominated eastern Mediterranean waters for over 2 centuries. The tactical conduct of the Actium engagement reflected the different strategic objectives that motivated the opposing commanders, as Octavian sought decisive victory that would eliminate his remaining rivals, while Cleopatra prioritized the preservation of sufficient forces to continue resistance from Egyptian bases. The Queen's decision to withdraw her squadron during the battle's climactic phase reflected strategic calculation rather than cowardice, as she recognized that continued fighting would likely result in the complete destruction of Egyptian naval power without achieving corresponding advantages against Octavian's numerically superior forces. The aftermath of Actium eliminated the last vestiges of Hellenistic political independence while establishing the foundations for the Roman Empire that would dominate Mediterranean civilization for the next 5 centuries. Octavian's pursuit of the defeated allies to Alexandria demonstrated Roman determination to achieve complete victory rather than negotiated settlement, as the future Augustus recognized that Cleopatra's survival would provide a continuing focus for opposition to Roman rule throughout the eastern territories that had comprised the Hellenistic kingdoms. Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BC marked the symbolic end of the Hellenistic age, as the last ruler who could claim direct descent from Alexander's successors chose death rather than submission to Roman authority. Her decision to die according to Egyptian royal traditions, reportedly through the bite of an asp that represented divine protection in pharaonic ideology, demonstrated her commitment to preserving the dignity of Hellenistic kingship even in defeat. The Queen's death eliminated the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, while providing Octavian with undisputed control over the wealthiest remaining Hellenistic territory. The Roman transformation of former Hellenistic kingdoms into imperial provinces occurred through administrative processes that preserved essential Greek institutions while integrating them into broader Roman governmental systems. The provincial organization that emerged during the early empire maintained Greek cities' traditional autonomy in local affairs while subjecting them to Roman oversight in matters affecting imperial security and revenue collection. This administrative approach recognized the practical value of existing Greek governmental structures, while ensuring that ultimate authority remained with Roman officials who could intervene when circumstances required direct imperial action. The preservation of Greek cultural institutions under Roman rule reflected both practical necessity and genuine Roman appreciation for Greek intellectual achievements. The gymnasium system that had served as the foundation for Greek education throughout the Hellenistic period continued to operate under Roman administration, providing training in Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric that Romans increasingly recognized as essential elements of civilized education. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to study in Athens, Rhodes, and other Greek educational centers, creating cultural connections that transcended political boundaries while ensuring the continuation of Greek intellectual traditions. The adoption of Greek artistic styles by Roman patrons created hybrid cultural forms that combined Greek technical excellence with Roman preferences for realistic portraiture and historical narrative. The sculptural programs that decorated Roman public buildings increasingly incorporated Greek mythological themes and artistic techniques, while Roman private collectors competed to acquire original Greek masterpieces or high-quality copies that could enhance their social status. This artistic appropriation ensured the preservation of Greek cultural achievements while adapting them to serve Roman political and social purposes. The influence of Greek philosophical schools on Roman intellectual development represented one of the most significant cultural transformations that accompanied political conquest, as Roman thinkers encountered systematic approaches to ethics, politics, and natural philosophy that had been refined through centuries of Greek theoretical development. Stoicism proved particularly attractive to Roman aristocrats, who found in its emphasis on duty, self-control, and acceptance of fate philosophical justifications for the responsibilities of imperial leadership. The writings of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius demonstrated how Greek philosophical concepts could be adapted to address the practical challenges of governing a vast empire while maintaining personal virtue under conditions of enormous power and responsibility. The spread of Christianity throughout the former Hellenistic territories occurred within cultural and administrative frameworks that had been established during the 3 centuries of Greek rule following Alexander's conquests. The common Greek language that served as the lingua franca of trade and administration provided the medium through which Christian texts could be disseminated across vast geographical distances, while the urban centres that had been established as Greek colonies became the focal points for early Christian communities. The intellectual traditions that had developed in cities like Alexandria and Antioch provided conceptual frameworks that Christian theologians could adapt for systematic presentation of their religious doctrines. The preservation of classical learning during the medieval period depended heavily on the institutional structures that had been created during the Hellenistic age and maintained under Roman rule. The libraries and schools that had been established in Alexandria, Pergamon, and other centres of Greek learning continued to function under Byzantine administration, preserving manuscripts and educational traditions that would otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals that accompanied the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The translation movements that transmitted Greek philosophical and scientific works to Islamic and later medieval European scholars relied on texts that had been preserved in these Hellenistic institutional contexts. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Eastern Roman territories represented the most direct continuation of Hellenistic political and cultural traditions, as Constantinople became the heir to Alexandria's role as the premier centre of Greek learning and Orthodox Christianity. The administrative systems that governed Byzantine territories retained essential features of Hellenistic governmental organisation, while adapting them to serve Christian imperial ideology and medieval political conditions. The survival of the Byzantine Empire until 1453 AD provided a continuous link between the Hellenistic kingdoms established by Alexander's successors and the modern Greek state that emerged from Ottoman rule in the 19th century. The enduring impact of the Hellenistic age on subsequent Western civilization extended far beyond the preservation of specific texts or institutional forms to encompass fundamental approaches to education, government, and cultural development that continue to influence modern societies. The concept of cosmopolitanism that emerged from the cultural synthesis achieved in Hellenistic cities provided intellectual foundations for later ideas about universal human rights and international cooperation that transcend ethnic and national boundaries. The scientific methods developed by scholars working in Alexandria and other Hellenistic centres established standards of empirical investigation and logical reasoning that remain essential elements of modern academic disciplines. The Hellenistic contribution to the development of international law and diplomacy reflected the practical necessities of governing diverse populations while maintaining relationships between different political entities across vast geographical distances. The treaty systems and diplomatic protocols that evolved during the 3 centuries of Hellenistic independence provided precedent for later international agreements while demonstrating the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different cultural and political systems. These diplomatic innovations proved particularly influential during the development of modern international institutions that seek to manage conflicts between sovereign states through negotiation rather than warfare. The artistic and architectural achievements of the Hellenistic period established aesthetic standards and technical capabilities that influenced subsequent cultural development throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The realistic portraiture and emotional expression that characterized Hellenistic sculpture provided models for Roman artists while contributing to the development of individualistic artistic traditions that emphasize personal psychology and human emotion. The urban planning principles that governed the construction of Hellenistic cities influenced Roman colonial development, while establishing patterns of civic organization that can be traced through medieval and modern European urban development. The ultimate significance of the Hellenistic age lies not merely in its role as a transitional period between classical Greek independence and Roman imperial domination, but in its creation of cultural and institutional frameworks that enable the preservation and transmission of classical achievements while facilitating their adaptation to serve the needs of subsequent civilizations. The 3 centuries that elapsed between Alexander's death and the fall of Cleopatra witnessed the transformation of Greek culture from a regional Mediterranean phenomenon into a universal system of education, government, and intellectual inquiry that would influence human development for millennia to come. The end of Hellenistic political independence marked not the conclusion of Greek cultural influence, but rather its incorporation into broader patterns of human civilization that continue to shape the modern world.